He captured more ships than any pirate in history. Over 400 vessels fell to his guns in a career that lasted just 3 years, a record that dwarfs the achievements of Blackbeard, Henry Morgan, and every other pirate whose name has come down through legend. He dressed in crimson silk and diamonds while his crew wore rags. He drank only tea while they consumed rivers of rum. He held divine services aboard his ship and forbade gambling among his men. And when he died in battle off the coast of Africa in 1722, the fortune he had accumulated simply vanished, never to be found. Bartholomew Roberts, known as Black Bart, was the most successful pirate of the Golden Age, and tonight we're going to follow his extraordinary story from beginning to end. If you're settling in for the night, this is exactly the kind of tale that works perfectly for sleep. Adventure on the high seas, treasures beyond counting, a man who made himself a king among outlaws, and a mystery that has never been solved. If you enjoy it, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next journey into forgotten history, and if you want to tell me where you're listening from tonight, drop a comment. I love knowing that someone in Wales, where Roberts was born, and someone in the Caribbean, where he made his name, and someone on the other side of the world are all drifting off to the same pirate dreams together. Now let's go back 300 years, to a Welsh village where a boy was born who would become the terror of 3 oceans. Bartholomew Roberts was born in 1682, in the village of Casnavyd Bach, known in English as Little Newcastle, in Pembrokeshire, Wales. The village sits in the southwestern corner of Wales, not far from the sea that would define Roberts's life and death. Little is known about his childhood or family. The records of rural Welsh villages in the 17th century are sparse, and Roberts left no memoirs or letters that have survived. What we know of his early life must be inferred from his later career, and from the few comments recorded by those who knew him. He went to sea young, as many Welsh boys did, learning the sailors' trade on merchant vessels that carried goods between Britain and the wider world. He proved capable and ambitious, rising through the ranks to become a mate, the officer second in command to the captain, a position of considerable responsibility that required navigation skills, leadership ability, and thorough knowledge of seamanship. By 1719, Roberts was serving as second mate aboard the Princess, a slave ship operating in the triangular trade between England, Africa, and the Americas. The slave trade was brutal but profitable, and positions aboard slavers were sought by sailors who cared more about wages than morality. The Princess had arrived at Anamabu on the Gold Coast of Africa, in what is now Ghana, to take on a cargo of enslaved Africans for transport to the Americas. It was there, in June 1719, that Roberts's life changed forever. The Princess was attacked and captured by 2 pirate ships commanded by Howell Davis, another Welshman who had turned to piracy after a career in legitimate maritime service. Davis was impressed by Roberts, a fellow countryman with obvious skills and intelligence, and forced him to join the pirate crew. This forced recruitment was common practice among pirates, who needed skilled sailors to operate their vessels and who had no scruples about compelling service from those they captured. Roberts's initial reaction to his forced recruitment was apparently reluctant. He had been a respectable officer on a legal vessel, with prospects for advancement in a legitimate career. Piracy offered wealth, but also the near certainty of an early death, whether by battle, disease, or the hangman's noose. The life expectancy of a Golden Age pirate was measured in months, not years, and Roberts was intelligent enough to understand the odds. But he also recognized the realities of his situation. Once a man had sailed with pirates, even under compulsion, he was legally a pirate himself, subject to execution if captured regardless of how he had come to be among them. The authorities made little distinction between willing pirates and forced men. Both could hang. Roberts reportedly remarked that since he had dipped his hands in muddy water, he might as well be hung for a sheep as a lamb. If he was going to be treated as a pirate anyway, he might as well embrace the role and enjoy its benefits. The benefits, for a man of Roberts's abilities, were considerable. Pirate crews operated as rough democracies, electing their captains and making major decisions by vote. Skilled and ambitious men could rise quickly, unconstrained by the rigid hierarchies of naval and merchant service. Roberts had been a second mate, a respectable but subordinate position. Among the pirates, his talents could take him to the top. He proved himself quickly, earning the respect of the crew through his competence and courage. When Howell Davis was killed in an ambush on the island of Príncipe just 6 weeks after Roberts joined the crew, the pirates elected Roberts as their new captain. It was an extraordinary rise, from forced recruit to supreme commander in less than 2 months, a testament to the impression Roberts had made on men who judged their leaders by ability rather than seniority. The death of Howell Davis and the circumstances of Roberts's election set the tone for his captaincy. Davis had been lured ashore on Príncipe by the Portuguese governor, who pretended friendship while planning an ambush. When Davis and his companions walked into the trap, they were cut down by musket fire. Davis managed to reach the beach before collapsing, dying in sight of his ships but beyond rescue. The pirates were devastated by the loss of their popular captain and furious at the treachery that had killed him. Roberts, newly elected, faced his first test of leadership. What to do about the Portuguese who had murdered his predecessor? His response established his reputation for decisive action and violent retribution. Roberts led his men back to Príncipe in a night attack that caught the Portuguese completely off guard. The pirates stormed the fort and the town, killing soldiers and civilians alike in revenge for Davis's death. They looted everything of value, destroyed what they could not carry, and burned the Portuguese ships in the harbour. The message was clear. Treachery against pirates would be punished without mercy. This willingness to retaliate on a massive scale would characterise Roberts's entire career, earning him a reputation that preceded his ships wherever they sailed. Merchants and colonists who heard of the destruction of Príncipe understood that resistance or betrayal would bring consequences far worse than simple surrender. The terror was strategic, designed to encourage quick capitulation and discourage any thought of fighting back. From Príncipe, Roberts sailed to the coast of Brazil, where he hoped to intercept the Portuguese treasure fleet that carried gold and diamonds from the mines of the interior to Lisbon. The Brazilian coast was rich hunting ground, with merchant ships moving constantly between the colony and the mother country, but it was also dangerous, patrolled by Portuguese warships and watched by colonial authorities alert for pirates. Roberts needed intelligence to find the treasure fleet, and he needed luck to catch it before the warships caught him. Both favoured him on this first great venture of his captaincy. He learned that the fleet was assembling at Bahia, preparing to sail under convoy escort back to Portugal. 42 merchant ships were loading in the harbour, their holds filling with the wealth of Brazil, while 2 powerful warships stood guard over them. A direct attack on the harbour was impossible. The warships would destroy the pirate vessels before they could reach the merchantmen. Roberts needed subterfuge, and he found it in the confusion of a crowded port. He sailed boldly into the harbour, his ship disguised as a merchant vessel, and anchored among the fleet as if he belonged there. In the bustle of loading and preparation, no one questioned his presence. Roberts spent the next day observing the ships, identifying which carried the richest cargoes and planning his escape. He selected the Sagrada Família, a ship of 40 guns loaded with gold, tobacco, sugar and hides, the most valuable vessel in the fleet. That night, he sent a boat to inform the captain that the commodore of the convoy required his presence aboard the flagship to discuss the sailing arrangements. The unsuspecting captain rowed over, leaving his ship without its commander. Roberts struck immediately. His men boarded the Sagrada Família, overwhelmed the remaining crew and cut the anchor cables. Before the alarm could be raised, the pirate ships were sailing out of the harbour with their prize, leaving the Portuguese warships and the rest of the fleet behind. It was a masterpiece of audacity and timing, a theft committed under the noses of the very forces meant to prevent it. The haul was enormous, 40,000 gold moidores, jewellery intended for the King of Portugal, and cargo worth a fortune. Roberts had been captain for barely a month, and he had already pulled off one of the most spectacular coups in pirate history. His reputation soared among the pirate community and spread terror among the merchants of the Atlantic. The success at Bahia established patterns that would define Roberts's career. He was willing to take risks that other pirates would not consider, attacking targets that seemed impossible, and using deception to achieve what force alone could not. He was also extraordinarily lucky, a quality that his crew attributed to divine favour, or perhaps to the devil's protection. Roberts himself seemed to believe that his success was fated, that he was destined for greatness until fate decided otherwise. This confidence, bordering on arrogance, made him both inspiring and dangerous to follow. Men who sailed with Roberts could expect rich prizes and bold leadership, but they could also expect to be led into situations where survival depended on everything going right. For 3 years, everything went right. Then, suddenly, it didn't. After the Brazilian triumph, Roberts sailed north toward the Caribbean. the traditional hunting ground of Atlantic pirates. The Caribbean was a maze of islands, channels, and colonial territories where pirates could find targets, sell plunder, and hide from pursuers. English, French, Spanish, and Dutch colonies dotted the islands, each with merchant traffic that could be attacked, and each with officials who could sometimes be bribed to look the other way. The pirates of the Golden Age moved through this complex environment like fish through coral, appearing suddenly to strike and disappearing into the countless hiding places that the geography provided. Roberts proved as adept in the Caribbean as he had been on the African coast and in Brazil, taking prize after prize as his reputation grew. The pirate fleet under Roberts's command expanded as success attracted new recruits, and captured vessels were added to the squadron. At various times, Roberts commanded anywhere from 1 to 4 ships, with crews totaling several hundred men. Managing this force required organisational skills that Roberts possessed in abundance. He established articles, the written rules that governed life aboard pirate ships, and enforced them strictly. His articles were among the most detailed to survive from the Golden Age, specifying everything from the division of plunder to the punishment for fighting aboard ship. The articles created order among men who had rejected the order of legitimate society, replacing the arbitrary authority of naval and merchant captains with a system of rules that the crew had agreed to follow. Roberts's articles were demanding but fair, and they attracted men who wanted the freedom of piracy without the chaos that could destroy a crew from within. The articles attributed to Roberts reveal much about his character and his approach to command. The first article established the democratic principle. Every man has a vote in affairs of moment, has equal title to the fresh provisions or strong liquors at any time seized, and may use them at pleasure unless a scarcity makes it necessary for the good of all to vote a retrenchment. This was radical democracy by the standards of the 18th century, when kings ruled by divine right and common sailors were treated as barely human. Roberts' men had a voice in decisions that affected them, a stake in the enterprise beyond mere survival. The principle of equal access to food and drink was equally significant. On merchant and naval vessels, officers ate well while sailors made do with whatever was left. Among Roberts's pirates, everyone shared the same provisions, a levelling of status that reinforced the democratic ethos. The second article addressed compensation for officers, the captain and quartermaster to receive 2 shares of a prize, the master, boatswain, and gunner 1 share and a half, and other officers 1 1/4. This hierarchy of rewards recognised that some roles required greater skill and carried greater responsibility, but the differences were far smaller than on legitimate vessels. A merchant captain might receive 10 or 20 times the compensation of a common sailor. Roberts received only twice the share of his men. This compressed hierarchy reflected the pirates' rejection of the extreme inequality that characterised legitimate maritime employment, while acknowledging that some differentiation was necessary to incentivize men to accept positions of responsibility. The third article prohibited gambling for money. No person to game at cards or dice for money. This prohibition was unusual among pirates, many of whom were inveterate gamblers, and it reflected Roberts's personal distaste for the quarrels and debts that gambling produced. A crew divided by gambling debts would be less effective in battle and more prone to internal conflict. Roberts, who seems to have been a calculating man rather than a risk-taker in his personal life, despite the risks he took professionally, understood that gambling undermined the unity on which successful piracy depended. The prohibition was part of a broader effort to maintain discipline and focus among men who might otherwise dissipate their energies in self-destructive behaviour. The fourth article established the curfew, the lights and candles to be put out at 8 o'clock at night. If any of the crew after that hour still remained inclined for drinking, they were to do it on the open deck. This rule combined fire safety with crew management. Open flames below decks were dangerous on wooden ships loaded with gunpowder. Countless vessels had been lost to fires that started from careless candles or pipes. The requirement to drink on the open deck after 8 o'clock acknowledged that men would drink regardless of rules, but directed that drinking to a safer location. It also imposed a rhythm on shipboard life, encouraging rest and ensuring that men would be functional for the next day's duties. The fifth article required maintenance of weapons, to keep their piece, pistols, and cutlass clean and fit for service. Pirates depended on their weapons for taking prizes and defending themselves against naval patrols. A weapon that misfired or broke in combat could mean death for its owner and danger for his crewmates. Roberts made weapon maintenance a collective responsibility, subject to inspection and punishment. A man whose weapons were found unfit for service could be punished at the discretion of the captain and crew, creating accountability that encouraged proper care. The 6th article excluded women, no boy or woman to be allowed amongst them. If any man were to be found seducing any of the latter sex and carrying her to sea disguised, he was to suffer death. This prohibition reflected practical concerns about the conflict that women's presence might cause among men competing for attention. The punishment was extreme, death for smuggling a woman aboard, indicating how seriously Roberts took the threat to crew unity. The prohibition against boys is less clear in its purpose. It may have reflected concerns about sexual exploitation, or about the practical limitations of having inexperienced youths in combat situations. The 7th article addressed desertion and cowardice. To desert the ship or their quarters in battle was punished with death or marooning. Pirates who fled during combat endangered everyone. A man who abandoned his post might leave a gap in the defence that allowed enemies to board, or might fail to perform some crucial task. The punishment was the most severe available, death or marooning, reflecting the existential threat that desertion posed. Marooning was often considered worse than death, a slow sentence of starvation and madness on some deserted island, and its inclusion as an alternative to execution suggests that the crew might choose the crueler punishment for particularly egregious cowardice. The 8th article prohibited fighting aboard ship. No striking one another on board, but every man's quarrels to be ended on shore at sword and pistol. Disputes were inevitable among violent men living in close quarters, but fighting aboard ship was forbidden because it could escalate and endanger everyone. Quarrels were channeled into formal duels conducted on shore, with the quartermaster presiding to ensure fair play. The duel procedure was specified. The quartermaster commanded the combatants to stand back to back, then turn and fire at the word of command. If both missed, they were to fall to their cutlasses, and he who drew first blood was declared the winner. This formalised system transformed spontaneous brawls into controlled rituals with predictable outcomes. The 9th article established disability compensation. If any man should lose a limb or become a cripple in their service, he was to have $800 out of the public stock, and for lesser hurts proportionably. This insurance provision was remarkably advanced for its time, guaranteeing compensation to men injured in the ship's service before any division of plunder. A man who lost an arm or leg would receive enough to live on for years, removing the fear of destitution that might otherwise make men hesitant to take risks in battle. The provision recognised that those who sacrificed their bodies for the collective enterprise deserved collective support. The 10th article specified the musicians' hours, the musicians to have rest on the Sabbath day, but the other 6 days and nights none, without special favour. Musicians were important aboard pirate ships, maintaining morale and coordinating work through shanties and other songs. The requirement that they play 6 days a week, with only Sunday for rest, shows how integral music was to shipboard life. The Sabbath exception also reveals a curious survival of religious observance among men who had otherwise rejected the laws of God and man. Roberts himself was known for his religious observances, a striking characteristic that set him apart from the stereotype of the godless pirate. He reportedly held divine services aboard his ship, allowed no work on Sundays except what was essential for navigation, and employed musicians to play hymns as well as sea songs. This piety coexisted with his willingness to kill, torture, and terrorize. Roberts saw no contradiction between faith and piracy. He may have believed, as many in the era did, that God favoured the bold and the strong, that success in worldly enterprises was evidence of divine approval, or his faith may have been compartmentalised, a private observance unconnected to his public actions. Whatever the psychology behind it, Roberts's religiosity made him a distinctive figure, a pirate who prayed before battle and gave thanks afterward, who observed the Sabbath on ships built for plunder. The 11th and final article defined the captain's authority. The captain is to have 2 full shares, the quartermaster 1 1/2, the doctor, gunner and boatswain 1 1/4, and the private men 1 share each. This article reinforces the compensation structure from earlier articles, but adds detail about specific positions. The inclusion of the doctor reflects the value placed on medical care. Ship surgeons were often pressed into pirate service because their skills were so valuable. The relative equality of compensation, with the captain receiving only twice what a common sailor received, contrasts sharply with the arrangements on legitimate vessels and underscores the egalitarian ethos of Roberts's crew. Roberts's personal habits were as distinctive as his articles. In an era when most sailors dressed in whatever rags they could acquire, Roberts was famous for his elegant attire. He wore a rich crimson damask waistcoat and breeches, a red feather in his hat, and a gold chain around his neck with a diamond cross suspended from it. His appearance was calculated to impress, distinguishing the captain from his men, and projecting an image of wealth and power that reinforced his authority. The contrast between Roberts's finery and his crew's rough clothing was deliberate, marking him as the leader while his democratic articles established him as first among equals. He managed the paradox skillfully, maintaining authority through presence and reputation while sharing power through the institutional structures he had created. His abstinence from alcohol was equally remarkable. In an age when pirates were synonymous with drunkenness, Roberts drank only tea, refusing the rum that his men consumed in quantities that would kill a modern person. This sobriety was both practical and principled. A captain who was drunk could not make the quick decisions that combat required. A crew with a sober leader had a better chance of survival than one whose commander was impaired. Roberts also seems to have genuinely disliked alcohol, preferring the mild stimulation of tea to the oblivion of rum. His sobriety set an example that he did not require his men to follow. They could drink as they pleased, within the limits set by the articles, but their captain would remain clear-headed. This combination of personal discipline and tolerance for others' indulgences was part of Roberts's formula for leadership, demanding excellence from himself while accepting the limitations of his followers. The practical operations of Roberts's fleet reveal a sophisticated understanding of naval warfare and commerce raiding. He typically commanded multiple ships, using the smaller vessels as scouts and the larger ones as platforms for overwhelming force. When a potential prize was sighted, the scouts would investigate, reporting back on the target's size, armament, and likely cargo. Roberts would then decide whether to attack, considering the risks and potential rewards with the calculating mind of a businessman as much as a warrior. Targets that seemed too strong or too poor would be allowed to pass. Targets that promised profit at acceptable risk would be engaged with overwhelming force that left resistance pointless. The attack itself followed patterns designed to maximize terror and minimize pirate casualties. Roberts's ships would approach flying false colours, often the flag of a friendly nation, to get close before revealing their true identity. At the last moment, the black flag would be raised, signalling that the approaching vessel was a pirate and that surrender was advisable. If the target failed to immediately strike its colours in submission, Roberts would raise the red flag, indicating that no quarter would be given, that everyone aboard would be killed regardless of resistance. This escalating threat system encouraged quick surrender. Captains who saw the black flag knew that they could save their lives and their crew's lives by giving up immediately, while those who hesitated risked the red flag and death. Most chose surrender, which was exactly the outcome Roberts wanted. Once a prize was taken, the pirates would board and systematically loot everything of value. Gold and silver were obvious targets, but pirates also sought navigation instruments, weapons, ammunition, sails, rope, food, and drink. Anything that could be used or sold was taken. The crew of the captured vessel would be questioned about any hidden valuables. Captains who had concealed treasure could expect torture until they revealed its location. Roberts was not known as personally cruel, unlike some pirates who seemed to enjoy inflicting pain, but he permitted violence when it served practical purposes. A captain who hid his cargo was withholding property that the pirates considered rightfully theirs. Persuading him to reveal its location was simply good business, whatever methods were required. The captured crew faced an uncertain fate depending on circumstances and Roberts's mood. Common sailors were often offered the choice of joining the pirates or being released. Many chose to join, attracted by the promise of wealth and freedom from the brutal conditions of merchant service. Skilled specialists like surgeons, carpenters, and navigators might be forced to serve whether they wished to or not, their talents too valuable to release. Officers faced scrutiny about how they had treated their crews. Captains known for cruelty might be beaten or killed, while those who had been fair might be treated with respect. Roberts reportedly asked captured sailors about their treatment, freeing those who had been used well and punishing officers who had abused their authority. This practice served both justice and recruitment, demonstrating to potential pirates that Roberts's crew was different from the tyrannical merchant service they were leaving behind. The geographic scope of Roberts's operations was extraordinary, covering the Atlantic from Brazil to Newfoundland, from the Caribbean to the African coast. No previous pirate had operated on such a scale or demonstrated such strategic mobility. When naval patrols made one area too dangerous, Roberts would sail thousands of miles to hunting grounds where his presence was unexpected. When he had exhausted the targets in one region, he would move to another, always staying ahead of the authorities and always finding new prizes to take. This mobility was possible because Roberts understood the Atlantic as a system, with trade routes, weather patterns, and seasonal variations that could be exploited by a commander who paid attention. He knew when the treasure fleet sailed, when the fishing boats gathered off Newfoundland, when the slave ships loaded on the African coast. This knowledge allowed him to position his forces where the prizes would be richest and the opposition weakest. The Caribbean operations that followed the Brazilian triumph established Roberts as the dominant pirate of the region. He cruised among the islands, taking prizes at will, his reputation growing with each success. Merchant captains who heard that Roberts was in the area faced difficult choices: sail and risk capture, or stay in port and lose money waiting for him to move on. Either choice cost them, which was exactly Roberts's intention. He was not merely stealing cargo but disrupting commerce, imposing costs on the entire trading system that extended far beyond the value of what he actually took. Colonial governors complained to London about the damage Roberts was causing, but the Royal Navy was stretched thin, and pirates who could sail faster than warships were difficult to catch. The attack on Trepassey, Newfoundland in June 1720 demonstrated Roberts's boldness and his contempt for opposition. Newfoundland was not traditional pirate territory. It was a cold, remote outpost known for its codfish rather than its gold. But the fishing fleets that gathered there each summer were valuable targets, and the naval presence was minimal. Roberts arrived with 2 ships and found 22 merchant vessels, and over 100 fishing boats in the harbour, along with a single armed vessel that was supposed to protect them. The armed vessel fled without fighting, and the merchants were defenceless. Roberts spent days looting at leisure, taking what he wanted from each ship and destroying those he had no use for. He burned and sank ships, seized supplies and equipment, and forced captured sailors to join his crew or suffer the consequences. When he finally sailed away, the Newfoundland fishery had been devastated, with losses that would take years to recover. The Newfoundland raid was terrorism as much as theft, a demonstration that Roberts could strike anywhere and that no one could stop him. The merchants and fishermen who survived told stories that spread along the Atlantic coast, adding to the legend that made Roberts simultaneously famous and feared. Colonial authorities were embarrassed by their inability to protect commerce. Naval commanders were frustrated by their inability to catch a pirate who seemed to anticipate their every move. Roberts taunted his pursuers, once sending a letter to the governor of Barbados promising to execute any Barbadian or Martinican sailors he captured, in retaliation for those islands' attempts to hunt him down. He kept that promise, hanging captured sailors from the yardarm and leaving their bodies as warnings to others who might cooperate with the authorities. After Newfoundland, Roberts sailed south to the Caribbean, where he continued his depredations among the islands. He took prizes steadily through the summer and fall of 1720, adding to his fleet and his fortune. The naval presence increased in response to his activities, with governors coordinating their efforts to trap him, but Roberts evaded their nets through speed, intelligence, and luck. He seemed to know when patrols were coming and where they would search, slipping away before they arrived and appearing somewhere else to strike again. His intelligence network relied on forced recruits who knew local waters, on information extracted from prisoners, and on the loose talk of sailors in port towns who spread news without knowing who was listening. The same Atlantic trading system that Roberts preyed upon provided him with the information he needed to continue preying upon it. The scale of Roberts's operations required sophisticated logistics that are often overlooked in romantic accounts of piracy. Ships needed food, water, ammunition, and maintenance. Crews needed medical care, replacement of casualties, and occasional rest on shore. Roberts managed these requirements through a combination of capture, purchase, and force. Supplies were taken from prizes whenever possible, reducing the need for legitimate commerce. When purchases were necessary, Roberts used intermediaries in ports where officials could be bribed or intimidated into looking the other way. Maintenance was conducted in remote anchorages where the pirates could careen their ships, scraping barnacles and making repairs without interference. Careening was a vulnerable time, with ships hauled onto their sides and unable to sail or fight. Roberts chose his careening sites carefully, posting guards and maintaining readiness even during the tedious work of hull maintenance. The crew that sailed with Roberts was a diverse group, including sailors from throughout the Atlantic world and beyond. Englishmen, Welshmen, Irishmen, Scots, Americans, Dutchmen, Frenchmen, Africans, and others served side by side, united by their rejection of legitimate society and their pursuit of pirate wealth. The diversity was practical as well as incidental. Men from different backgrounds brought different skills, different languages, and different knowledge of different waters. A sailor who knew the African coast could guide the ship through dangers that a Caribbean veteran would not recognise. A man who spoke French could negotiate in ports where English was not understood. Roberts valued competence over nationality, promoting men based on their abilities and maintaining discipline that prevented the ethnic and national conflicts that divided other crews. The presence of African men among Roberts's crew is particularly notable. Some were formerly enslaved people who had been freed when pirates captured the slave ships transporting them. Others had joined voluntarily from coastal African communities that had their own maritime traditions. The status of black pirates was ambiguous. Some accounts suggest they were treated as equals, sharing in plunder and voting with the rest of the crew, while others suggest they occupied subordinate positions, doing the hardest work and receiving smaller shares. The truth probably varied by ship and by individual. Roberts's articles do not mention race, neither guaranteeing equality nor specifying discrimination, leaving the matter to custom and the attitudes of the crew. What is clear is that men of African descent sailed with Roberts and fought alongside European pirates, participating in an enterprise that rejected the rigid hierarchies of colonial society even if it did not fully embrace racial equality. The fortune that Roberts accumulated through his hundreds of captures was immense, though the exact amount is impossible to calculate. Each prize yielded something: gold and silver from treasure ships, trade goods from merchantmen, supplies from fishing boats. The big scores, like the Sagrada Família in Brazil, produced wealth that would have been remarkable for a lifetime. Roberts achieved such coups multiple times in his 3-year career. The gold alone would have been worth millions in modern currency, and the total value of goods taken must have been many times that. Where did all this wealth go? The question has fascinated treasure hunters for 3 centuries, because most of it was never recovered. Some of the plunder was spent immediately, consumed in the ports where pirates could find welcome. Port towns throughout the Caribbean, on the American coast, and in Africa had economies that depended partly on pirate spending. Taverns, brothels, and merchants catered to pirates flush with plunder, extracting as much as they could before the money ran out. Pirates were notoriously bad at saving. Men who might die tomorrow saw little point in hoarding wealth for a future that might never come. Roberts's crew would have spent freely whenever they had the opportunity, enjoying the pleasures that their dangerous profession had earned them. Much of Roberts's treasure thus dispersed into the economies of port towns, impossible to trace or recover. Some plunder was divided among the crew and taken away by men who left the pirate life. Not everyone who joined Roberts stayed until the end. Some were killed, some were captured, some deserted, some were marooned, and some simply chose to leave when the opportunity arose. Men who departed with their shares might have established themselves in communities far from the sea, living quietly on pirate wealth that no one connected to its source. A sailor who appeared in a colonial town with a modest amount of money could claim it came from a lucky voyage or a small inheritance. No one would suspect that he had been a pirate unless he was careless or unlucky. The shares distributed to departed pirates are another portion of Roberts's treasure that simply vanished into the broader economy. But what about Roberts's own share, the captain's double portion accumulated over 400 prizes? What about the reserves kept for the ship's expenses, the emergency funds that would allow operations to continue even after a run of bad luck? This treasure, which should have been substantial, has never been found. Roberts did not spend lavishly on shore. His famous costume was his one indulgence, and he reportedly reinvested most of his share in the enterprise. He must have had a reserve somewhere, either aboard his ship or hidden on shore, a war chest that could fund future operations or provide for his retirement if he ever chose to stop. The location of this reserve died with him, or perhaps with one of the few trusted officers who might have known where it was hidden. The possibility that Roberts buried treasure somewhere along his route has attracted speculation, and searching for centuries. The classic image of pirates burying chests of gold on tropical islands derives partly from the histories of Roberts and his contemporaries, men who operated in regions with countless small islands where treasure could theoretically be concealed. But the practical difficulties of burying treasure were considerable. A captain who buried his wealth somewhere and later died or was captured would lose it forever. The treasure would benefit no one, including himself. A captain who told others where it was buried risked betrayal. The pirates who knew the location might decide to take it for themselves rather than wait for their leader to recover it. Burying treasure made sense only in specific circumstances, as a temporary measure while some danger passed, or as an insurance against capture. Whether Roberts ever faced such circumstances is unknown, and if he did, whether he chose to bury treasure and where he might have done so remain mysteries. The Caribbean operations continued through the fall of 1720 and into 1721, with Roberts taking prizes regularly and evading the naval patrols that hunted him. His fleet varied in size as ships were added and lost. Crews expanded through recruitment and shrank through desertion and death. The constant turnover meant that Roberts had to repeatedly integrate new men into his system, teaching them the articles and establishing the discipline that made his operation successful. He proved adept at this socialization, transforming criminals and former merchant sailors into effective pirates who followed his leadership even into dangerous situations. The success bred more success. Each prize taken demonstrated that Roberts knew what he was doing, encouraging men to trust his judgment even when his plans seemed reckless. The decision to return to Africa in the spring of 1721 reflected Roberts's strategic thinking and his restlessness. The Caribbean was becoming increasingly dangerous, with multiple naval vessels now hunting specifically for him. The African coast, where his career had begun, offered fresh targets and fewer warships. The slave trade was flourishing, with ships carrying valuable cargoes both ways. Trade goods heading to Africa, enslaved people heading to the Americas. Roberts knew these waters from his service on the Princess and from his early months as a pirate. He could navigate the hazards and exploit the opportunities better than naval commanders who were unfamiliar with the coast. The return to Africa would prove to be both his greatest hunting ground and the site of his final battle. The crossing to Africa took Roberts across the Atlantic, a voyage of several weeks that tested the endurance of ships and crews. The open ocean offered no prizes but also no pursuers. The pirates could rest and refit during the crossing, preparing for the campaign ahead. Roberts used the time to maintain discipline and morale, holding the services and enforcing the articles that kept his crew functional. The musicians played, the lookouts watched, and the ships sailed eastward toward a continent where Roberts would capture more ships than in any other region of his career. The African coast in the early 18th century was a complex environment where European trading posts coexisted with African kingdoms, where the slave trade created wealth and misery in equal measure, and where the line between legitimate commerce and piracy was often unclear. European nations maintained fortified trading posts along the coast, exchanging manufactured goods for enslaved Africans, gold, ivory, and other valuable commodities. African rulers controlled the supply of captives, profiting from the trade while negotiating among European competitors for the best terms. Ships arrived constantly, loading and unloading at the coastal stations, creating a target-rich environment for pirates who knew how to exploit it. Roberts arrived on the African coast in the summer of 1721 and immediately began taking prizes. His first major capture was the Onslow, a large vessel of the Royal African Company, the English monopoly that controlled the slave trade from English forts. The Onslow carried valuable cargo and, more importantly, provided Roberts with a ship large and powerful enough to serve as his flagship. He renamed her the Royal Fortune, the third ship he'd given that name, and refitted her for pirate service, adding guns and modifying the rigging for speed. The Royal Fortune would be his final command, the ship aboard which he would live and die. The captures multiplied through the summer and fall. Roberts cruised along the coast from Senegal to the Niger Delta, appearing at trading posts and anchorages where ships gathered to load. His reputation preceded him. Captains who heard that Roberts was in the area sometimes fled rather than risk capture, while others calculated that resistance was futile and surrendered as soon as they saw his flag. The take was enormous. Ships, cargo, supplies, and recruits flowed steadily into Roberts's fleet. He was adding to his already legendary total, pushing toward the 400 ships that would make him the most successful pirate in history by any statistical measure. The impact on the slave trade was substantial, disrupting the flow of human cargo that planters in the Americas depended upon. Ships that should have been loading enslaved Africans were instead being captured by pirates, their cargoes seized, their crews given the choice of joining or being released. The enslaved people aboard captured slavers faced uncertain fates. Some were reportedly freed, others were taken as crew. Still others may have been sold to the same traders who would have bought them anyway. The pirates' attitude toward the slave trade was ambivalent, neither consistently opposing it nor consistently participating in it. Roberts himself seems to have had no particular views on slavery as an institution. He attacked slave ships because they were valuable targets, not because he objected to their cargo. The African operations established the final pattern of Roberts's career, a rhythm of cruising, capturing and evading that continued for months. The local naval presence was minimal, with only a few warships assigned to protect the vast coastline, and Roberts easily avoided these scattered patrols. He knew the coast better than his pursuers, knew where to find prizes and where to find shelter, knew the winds and currents that governed movement along the shore. His local knowledge, combined with his superior speed and his network of informants, allowed him to operate with near impunity through the fall of 1721 and into the winter of 1722. The crew during this period grew restless despite the steady prizes. Life aboard a pirate ship was hard even in the best circumstances, and months of cruising in tropical waters brought disease, boredom, and the tensions that accumulated when violent men lived in close quarters. The articles maintained order, and Roberts's authority remained unquestioned, but the strain was visible in minor conflicts and disciplinary problems. Some men wanted to return to the Caribbean, where the climate was more familiar and the pleasures of port towns more accessible. Others wanted to make one big score and retire, disappearing into some colony where they could live quietly on their accumulated wealth. Roberts held the crew together through force of personality and the prospect of continued prizes, but the cohesion that had characterized his earlier operations was beginning to fray. The election that had made Roberts captain could also unmake him. Pirate democracy meant that the crew could vote to remove their leader if they lost confidence in his judgment or his luck. Roberts had never faced such a challenge, his success having silenced any potential opposition, but the discontent that grew during the African operations might have eventually produced one. He was aware of the grumbling and tried to address it by maintaining the pace of captures and by promising that the cruise would end soon, that they would return to the Caribbean or to some safe port where the men could enjoy their wealth. Whether these promises would have been enough will never be known, because events intervened before the crew's patience ran out. The articles that Roberts had written included provisions for the ship's goods if the captain was killed or the ship taken. These provisions suggest that Roberts understood the precariousness of his position, that he knew his career would end eventually and wanted to ensure that his men would be provided for when it did. The provisions specified how plunder would be divided, how the ship would be disposed of, and how disputes among survivors would be resolved. They were the testament of a man who expected to die violently and wanted his affairs in order when he did. The foresight was characteristic of Roberts's careful approach to leadership, planning for contingencies that he hoped would never occur while recognizing that hope was not a strategy. The HMS Swallow, the ship that would end Roberts's career, was a 50-gun warship of the Royal Navy commanded by Captain Challoner Ogle. Ogle had been assigned to patrol the African coast specifically to hunt pirates, and he took his mission seriously. Unlike many naval officers who were content to convoy merchant ships and avoid confrontation, Ogle actively sought out Roberts, gathering intelligence about his movements and positioning his ship to intercept. Ogle was a capable commander with a well-trained crew, and he understood that catching Roberts would require patience, skill and luck. He had all three. The meeting between Ogle and Roberts was not accidental, but the result of careful preparation on Ogle's part. He had learned that Roberts was operating near Cape Lopez, on the coast of what is now Gabon, and he sailed there hoping to find his quarry. On the morning of February 10th, 1722, the Swallow sighted Roberts's fleet at anchor, 3 ships taking on water and provisions for the next leg of their cruise. Roberts had let down his guard, confident that no naval vessel would find him in this remote location, and his lookouts had not detected the Swallow's approach until it was too late to flee easily. The pirates faced a choice: run and hope to escape, or fight and hope to win. Roberts chose to fight, or rather the situation forced him to fight. One of his ships, the Ranger, was commanded by a captain named James Skyrm, who had been separated from the fleet and was returning when the Swallow appeared. Skyrm apparently mistook the Swallow for a merchant ship and approached to capture her, a fatal error that revealed the confusion among the pirates. Ogle engaged the Ranger, capturing her after a fierce battle that killed Skyrm and many of his crew. The capture gave Ogle prisoners who could provide intelligence about Roberts' strength and intentions, and it reduced the pirate fleet by one ship. Roberts now faced a warship that had already proven its capability against one of his vessels. The night that followed the capture of the Ranger was tense aboard the Royal Fortune. Roberts knew that the Swallow would return, probably the next day, and that a battle was inevitable. His crew was divided between those who wanted to fight and those who wanted to flee. The articles gave every man a vote, and the debate reportedly lasted into the night. Roberts himself favoured fighting, confident in his ship's guns and his crew's courage, and his view prevailed. The pirates prepared for battle, loading their guns, checking their weapons, and drinking to give themselves courage for the fight ahead. Many were drunk by the time the Swallow reappeared on the morning of February 10th, their judgment impaired at the worst possible moment. The Battle of Cape Lopez began around 10 o'clock in the morning, when the Swallow approached the Royal Fortune under false colours, disguised as a merchant ship seeking to avoid notice. Roberts was not fooled. He recognised the Swallow from her lines and her movement, and he knew that the engagement he had chosen was about to begin. He dressed in his finest clothes, the crimson damask waistcoat and the gold chain with its diamond cross, determined to meet his fate in the style that had characterised his career. If he was going to die, he would die as Bartholomew Roberts, not as the obscure Welsh sailor who had been forced into piracy 3 years before. Roberts ordered his ship to sail toward the Swallow rather than away from her, seeking to get to windward where he would have the advantage of manoeuvrability. The pirates fired first, their guns throwing shot toward the approaching warship, but the range was long and the damage minimal. Ogle held his fire, closing the distance before responding with a devastating broadside that swept the Royal Fortune's deck with grape shot. The effect was immediate and terrible. Men fell screaming, ropes parted, sails were torn, and in the chaos of the first exchange, Bartholomew Roberts was killed. The grape shot that killed Roberts struck him in the throat, a wound that was fatal almost instantly. He was standing on deck directing his ship's manoeuvres when the spray of iron balls cut him down. His crew saw their captain fall and knew immediately that he was dead or dying. The crimson waistcoat was soaked with blood that was darker than the dyed silk, and Roberts's body lay motionless where it had fallen. The effect on morale was devastating. Roberts had held the crew together through force of personality and the confidence that his luck would see them through. With him dead, that confidence collapsed. Men who had been ready to fight to the death moments before now thought only of escape or surrender. Before the battle could continue, Roberts's crew fulfilled what they believed was their captain's last wish. According to accounts recorded after the battle, Roberts had asked to be buried at sea if he was killed, rather than have his body taken by the Navy and displayed as a trophy. His men honoured this request even in the chaos of battle, throwing his body overboard before the Swallow could close and capture them. Bartholomew Roberts sank into the Atlantic, his body weighted with his weapons and his jewels, never to be recovered. The diamonds and gold that he wore went with him, a small treasure lost with the man who had accumulated so much more. With Roberts dead and overboard, the fight went out of the pirates. Some continued to resist for a time, firing at the Swallow and attempting to manoeuvre, but the coordination that had made them effective was gone. The drunk men who had stayed up all night debating whether to fight were in no condition to win a battle against a disciplined naval crew, and the sober men who might have rallied them had either been killed or were demoralised by their captain's death. One by one, the gun crews stopped firing, the helmsman lost control of the ship, and the resistance collapsed into confusion. When Ogle's men finally boarded the Royal Fortune, they found a ship in chaos, strewn with dead and wounded, her surviving crew more interested in hiding or destroying evidence than in continued fighting. The capture of the Royal Fortune and her consorts yielded a haul of pirates for trial and execution. 264 men were taken alive, the largest mass capture of pirates in the Golden Age. They were brought to Cape Coast Castle, the English slave trading fort in what is now Ghana, where they were held pending trial. The The trial itself was conducted by an Admiralty court convened specifically for the purpose, with judges sent from England to ensure that proper legal forms were observed. The proceedings lasted for weeks, as each defendant was charged and evidence was presented against him. The pirates had few defences available, most had clearly participated in piracy, and the articles they had signed were damning evidence of criminal intent. The verdicts were largely predetermined by the nature of the charges. Piracy was a capital offence, and men convicted of it were sentenced to death by hanging. The judges distinguished between men who had joined willingly and those who could credibly claim they had been forced, granting some acquittals and reduced sentences to those whose involvement seemed coerced. But the majority of defendants had no such defence. They had signed articles, shared in plunder, and participated in attacks, all of which made them guilty under the law. 52 men were sentenced to death, the largest mass execution of pirates ever carried out. Others received lesser sentences, including transportation to penal colonies, imprisonment, or service in the Royal Navy. The trials were intended as a spectacle, a demonstration that piracy would be punished and that the Golden Age was coming to an end. The executions were carried out at Cape Coast Castle. The bodies hung in chains along the coast as a warning to others who might be tempted by piracy. The gibbeted corpses rotted in the tropical sun, picked at by birds and gradually reduced to skeletons that still hung in their iron cages. Sailors on passing ships could see them for years afterward, reminders of what awaited those who followed Roberts's path. The spectacle was intended to deter, and to some extent it succeeded. The golden age of piracy was already fading by 1722, and the mass execution at Cape Coast accelerated its end. Pirates who heard of the fate of Roberts's crew had reason to reconsider their career choice, to accept pardons when offered, or to seek retirement before they too ended up in chains. The treasure that Roberts had accumulated was never found on the captured ships. The pirates had apparently thrown valuable items overboard during the battle, or hidden them in ways that the Navy could not discover. Some gold and goods were recovered, but nothing like the fortune that Roberts must have possessed after 400 captures. The Navy searched the ships thoroughly, interrogated the prisoners about hidden treasure, and even tortured some in the hope of extracting information, but the bulk of the plunder remained missing. Either it had been disposed of before the battle, or it was concealed so well that the searchers could not find it. The mystery of Roberts's treasure began at the moment of his death, and has continued ever since. Captain Ogle was rewarded handsomely for his victory. He was knighted for his capture of Roberts, becoming Sir Challoner Ogle, the only naval officer ever knighted specifically for defeating pirates. The honour reflected the significance of Roberts's capture in the eyes of the authorities. This was no ordinary pirate but the most successful rover of the age, whose death marked a turning point in the struggle to suppress piracy. Ogle continued his naval career with distinction, eventually rising to the rank of admiral. His name appears in history books primarily for the engagement at Cape Lopez, the battle that ended the career of Bartholomew Roberts and helped end the golden age of piracy itself. The death of Roberts was more than the loss of one pirate captain. It was a symbol of the changing times that made large-scale piracy increasingly impossible. The coordination among colonial authorities that had trapped Roberts in Africa reflected a new seriousness about suppressing piracy, a willingness to invest resources and share intelligence that had been lacking in earlier years. The naval patrols that hunted pirates were becoming more numerous and more effective, while the safe harbours where pirates had once found welcome were closing under pressure from metropolitan governments. The Caribbean, the traditional heartland of Atlantic piracy, was becoming too dangerous for pirates to operate openly. The African coast, where Roberts had gone to escape Caribbean patrols, proved just as dangerous in the end. The Golden Age was ending because the conditions that had made it possible were disappearing. The legacy of Bartholomew Roberts extends beyond his record of captures to his influence on pirate culture and popular imagination. The articles he wrote became a model for other pirate crews, spreading through the Atlantic pirate community and shaping how pirates organized themselves. His distinctive personal style, the elegant clothes and the tea drinking and the religious observances made him memorable in an era full of memorable characters. His willingness to attack anywhere, from Brazil to Newfoundland to Africa, demonstrated a strategic ambition that other pirates could only envy. And his death in battle, standing on his deck in his finest clothes, provided a romantic ending that has captivated storytellers ever since. Roberts was not merely successful, He was legendary, and the legend has outlasted the historical details. The question of Roberts's missing treasure has fascinated historians and treasure hunters for 3 centuries. 400 ships captured over 3 years should have produced wealth beyond calculation, yet very little was recovered when his fleet was taken. Where did it all go? The question has multiple possible answers, each accounting for some portion of the missing fortune, but none fully explaining the gap between what Roberts must have taken and what was ever found. The first and most prosaic answer is that the treasure was spent. Pirates were not known for frugality, and Roberts's crew was no exception. Every time the fleet touched port, men would go ashore with their shares and spend freely on drink, women and gambling, returning to the ship with empty pockets and happy memories. The ports that catered to pirates existed specifically to separate them from their money, and they were efficient at their work. A man who captured £100 in gold might spend it all in a week of debauchery, leaving nothing to show for his dangerous work except a headache and perhaps a disease. Multiplied across hundreds of men over 3 years, the spending would have consumed an enormous amount of the total plunder. The second answer is that the treasure was divided and dispersed. Not every man who sailed with Roberts died at Cape Lopez or was captured afterward. Throughout his career, men joined and left his crew, some voluntarily and some not. Those who left took their shares with them, small fortunes that they might have spent, invested or hidden depending on their circumstances and personalities. A sailor who had accumulated a few £100s from his pirate career might have settled in some colonial town, living quietly on his savings and telling no one where the money came from. These individual hoards, scattered across the Atlantic world, would be impossible to trace or recover. They simply melted into the legitimate economy, their pirate origins forgotten. The third answer is that Roberts kept a reserve that was hidden before the final battle. A prudent captain would have maintained funds for emergencies, for repairs and supplies and bribes that might be needed unexpectedly. This reserve would have been separate from the crew's shares and the ship's operating expenses, a war chest that the captain controlled personally. If Roberts had such a reserve, and given his careful management it seems likely that he did, he would have hidden it somewhere secure, either aboard ship in a location known only to him or ashore at some point along his route. The hidden reserve, if it exists, would be the buried treasure of legend waiting to be discovered by whoever can figure out where Roberts put it. The candidates for such a hiding place are numerous, spanning the entire Atlantic coast that Roberts cruised. Any of the hundreds of islands in the Caribbean could theoretically conceal pirate treasure. The same is true of the coasts of Brazil, West Africa, and even Newfoundland. Roberts visited all of these regions, and any of them might have provided a suitable location for hiding valuables. The problem for treasure hunters is the vastness of the search area and the absence of any reliable information about where Roberts might have buried anything. The romantic image of a treasure map with an X marking the spot is fiction. Real pirates did not make maps to their hiding places because such maps could fall into the wrong hands. If Roberts buried treasure, he kept the location in his head, and that information died with him at Cape Lopez. The fourth possibility is that the treasure went overboard during or before the battle. Faced with capture, pirates sometimes threw their valuables into the sea rather than let them fall into the hands of their enemies. The logic was partly spite and partly practical. Throwing treasure overboard eliminated evidence that might be used against them at trial, and it denied the Navy the satisfaction of recovering pirate loot. Roberts's crew reportedly threw his body overboard immediately after his death, along with his weapons and jewels. They may have thrown other valuables as well, scattering gold and silver into the waters off Cape Lopez, where it would never be recovered. The seafloor near the battle site may be littered with pirate treasure, but recovering it would be extraordinarily difficult even with modern technology. The fifth possibility is that the treasure was hidden on the ships in ways that the Navy could not find. Pirates were creative about concealment, building secret compartments, hollowing out structural timbers, and using other techniques to create hiding places that even thorough searches might miss. The Navy that captured the Royal Fortune was looking for treasure, but they may not have known all the tricks that pirates used to hide it. The treasure might have been aboard the ships all along, invisible to the searchers who were convinced it must be there somewhere. If so, it stayed hidden until the ships were eventually broken up, at which point it might have been discovered by shipyard workers who kept their find quiet, or it might have been discarded along with the rotted timbers that contained it. Each of these possibilities accounts for part of the missing treasure, and together they probably account for most of it. The spending, the division among departed crew members, the hidden reserves, the goods thrown overboard, and the concealed hoards aboard ship all claimed portions of Roberts's fortune. What remains unclear is whether any significant amount survives in a recoverable form, waiting for a lucky finder to stumble upon it, or a persistent researcher to locate it through historical detective work. The treasure hunters who have searched for Roberts's gold have found nothing conclusive, but the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Somewhere, perhaps, the fortune that nobody found still waits. The historical sources for Roberts's career are surprisingly good compared to other pirates of the era, largely because of the detailed account in Captain Charles Johnson's A General History of the Pirates, published in 1724, just 2 years after Roberts's death. Johnson, whose identity remains uncertain and who may have been Daniel Defoe writing under a pseudonym, had access to trial records, newspaper accounts, and possibly interviews with survivors of Roberts's crew or those who had encountered him. The general history is not perfectly reliable. Johnson included invented dialogue, embellished dramatic moments, and made errors about dates and details. But its account of Roberts is broadly consistent with other sources, including the official records of the Cape Coast trials, and it provides the fullest narrative we have of his remarkable career. The trial records from Cape Coast Castle supplement Johnson's account with legal documents that record the charges against each defendant and the evidence presented. These records name the ships Roberts captured, the dates and locations of attacks, and the roles that individual pirates played in the enterprise. They also record the testimony of witnesses, including captured sailors who had been pressed into service and who provided the prosecution with detailed information about pirate operations. The trial records are dry and legalistic compared to Johnson's colourful narrative, but they anchor the story in verifiable facts and provide details that Johnson either did not know or chose not to include. Newspaper accounts from the period add further details, particularly about Roberts's attacks on English shipping. Colonial newspapers reported pirate sightings and captures, warned merchants about dangerous waters, and occasionally published letters or proclamations from the pirates themselves. Roberts's letter to the governor of Barbados, threatening retaliation against Barbadian sailors, was published in contemporary newspapers and has survived in that form. These scattered reports, collected from newspapers published in London, Boston, Philadelphia, and the Caribbean, create a patchwork of information that complements the more systematic accounts in Johnson and the trial records. The physical evidence of Roberts's career has largely disappeared. His ships were captured, used briefly by the Navy, and eventually broken up. No wreckage has been identified as belonging to his fleet. His personal possessions went overboard with his body, lost in the waters off Cape Lopez. The goods he captured were sold, consumed, or absorbed into the legitimate economy, impossible to distinguish from similar goods that had never passed through pirate hands. A few artifacts may survive in private collections, their provenance uncertain and their authenticity unverifiable. The material culture of piracy, unlike that of more settled societies, left few traces because pirates were constantly moving, constantly consuming their gains, and constantly at risk of losing everything to capture or shipwreck. The interpretation of Roberts' career has varied over the centuries, reflecting changing attitudes toward piracy, crime, and the social order. In his own time, Roberts was viewed as a dangerous criminal, a threat to commerce and to the colonial system that commerce supported. The authorities who hunted him and executed his crew saw themselves as defending civilization against barbarism, order against chaos. The executions at Cape Coast were a triumph of law over lawlessness, a demonstration that the state was stronger than the pirates who challenged it. This view persisted through the 18th and 19th centuries, when piracy was remembered primarily as a problem that had been solved, a disorder that had been suppressed by the forces of progress. The 20th century brought more sympathetic interpretations, influenced by social history's interest in those who resisted authority and by popular culture's romanticization of pirates. Historians began to see Roberts and his crew not merely as criminals but as workers who had rejected an exploitative economic system, creating their own alternative society on the margins of the Atlantic world. The articles that Roberts wrote were studied as evidence of pirate democracy, remarkable for their egalitarianism in an era of rigid hierarchy. The attacks on slave ships were sometimes interpreted as proto-abolitionist. though the evidence for any anti-slavery sentiment among pirates is weak. Roberts became a figure of resistance as well as crime, a symbol of freedom as well as lawlessness. The 21st century has seen more nuanced interpretations that recognize both the genuine innovations of pirate culture and the genuine harm that pirates caused. Roberts was democratic in his relations with his crew, but terroristic in his treatment of those he captured. His articles provided for disability compensation and equal shares, but also mandated death for desertion and mutilation for theft. He rejected the hierarchies of merchant and naval service, but created his own hierarchy, with himself at the top in his crimson silks while his men wore whatever they could find. The pirate alternative to the Atlantic economy was real, but it was built on violence and sustained by theft. It was not a utopia, but a different kind of dystopia, offering freedom to some at the cost of suffering for others. The comparison between Roberts and other famous pirates of the Golden Age illuminates what made him exceptional. Blackbeard, whose fearsome image has made him the most famous pirate of all, captured perhaps 40 ships during his career, 1/10 of Roberts's total. Henry Every, whose capture of a Mughal treasure ship made him briefly the most wanted man in the world, had a career measured in months and captures measured in single digits. Charles Vane, notorious for cruelty and defiance, took a few dozen prizes before his crew deposed him. Calico Jack Rackham, famous for his association with Anne Bonny and Mary Red, was a minor figure whose fleet was tiny and whose captures were unremarkable. By any quantitative measure, Roberts dwarfed his contemporaries. He was not merely one great pirate among several, but the greatest by a substantial margin. The qualitative differences are equally significant. Roberts demonstrated strategic vision that other pirates lacked, thinking in terms of campaigns and systems rather than individual captures. He understood that the Atlantic was a connected network, and that mobility within that network conferred advantages that sedentary pirates could not match. He built and maintained a fleet rather than relying on a single ship, creating redundancy that protected against loss and multiplied his force when attacks required it. He wrote articles that established consistent governance across his command, creating institutional continuity that survived changes in personnel. He managed logistics, intelligence, and morale with a sophistication that would have been creditable in a naval officer. Roberts was not just a successful criminal, but a talented administrator who happened to apply his talents to crime. His personal characteristics set him apart as well. The tea-drinking, Bible-reading, elegantly dressed captain was unlike the stereotypical pirate in almost every way. Roberts did not swagger and carouse, he calculated and commanded. His sobriety was not mere personal preference but a leadership choice, keeping him sharp while his men indulged. His religious observances were not hypocrisy but genuine devotion, coexisting in his mind with his willingness to kill and plunder. His costume was not vanity but theatre, projecting an image that reinforced his authority and made him memorable to friends and enemies alike. Everything about Roberts seemed designed to distinguish him from ordinary pirates, to mark him as exceptional even among those who'd already set themselves apart from ordinary humanity. The death that ended his career was as dramatic as the life that preceded it. Standing on the deck in his finest clothes, refusing to flee or hide, Roberts embodied the fearlessness that had made him famous. The grape shot that killed him came without warning, ending his life in an instant before he could realize what had happened. His crew's decision to throw his body overboard, honoring his wish to avoid capture even in death, ensured that his remains would never be displayed or desecrated. He sank into the Atlantic still wearing his diamond cross, still dressed in crimson damask, a dramatic exit from a dramatic life. The image has captivated writers and artists ever since. The pirate king dying in battle with his flag still flying, consigned to the sea that had been his domain. The aftermath of Roberts's death marked the effective end of the golden age of piracy in the Atlantic. Other pirates continued to operate, but none achieved anything like Roberts's success, and the increasing effectiveness of naval patrols made large-scale piracy increasingly difficult. The last major trials of Golden Age pirates occurred within a few years of Cape Lopez, and by the late 1720s the era was effectively over. Piracy would continue in other forms in other places, but the Golden Age, the brief period when pirates ruled large portions of the Atlantic and accumulated fortunes that rivaled those of colonial governors, was finished. Roberts had been its greatest figure, and his death was its effective end. the treasure that Roberts accumulated remains the most tantalizing aspect of his legacy, the mystery that draws treasure hunters and historians alike. 400 ships should have produced wealth beyond counting, yet almost nothing has been recovered. The multiple explanations for the missing fortune, spending, dispersal, concealment, destruction and hiding, all probably contributed to the outcome, but none fully satisfies the imagination. Somewhere, perhaps, a portion of Roberts's treasure still exists, waiting to be found by someone who can solve the puzzle of where he might have put it. The search continues, as it has continued for 3 centuries, driven by the same combination of greed and curiosity that drove Roberts himself. The islands of the Caribbean, where Roberts operated extensively during 1720 and 1721, have been searched repeatedly for buried pirate treasure. Every likely-looking island has been explored, every cave investigated, every anomaly in the landscape tested by hopeful hunters. The results have been uniformly disappointing. No significant pirate treasure has ever been recovered from the Caribbean, despite centuries of searching and countless claims of discovery. The absence of finds suggests either that pirates did not bury treasure in the way legend suggests, or that any buried treasure was recovered long ago and kept quiet, or that the hiding places were too good for the searchers who sought them. The Caribbean remains pirate country in the popular imagination, but the treasure that supposedly lies hidden there has proved impossible to locate. The African coast, where Roberts spent the last year of his career, offers another set of potential hiding places. The coastline is long and complicated, with countless inlets, islands, and obscure anchorages where a ship might stop and a captain might bury valuables. Roberts knew this coast well and spent months cruising along it, with ample opportunity to select a hiding place and prepare it for future use. The relative obscurity of the West African coast in the Western imagination has protected it from the intensive treasure hunting that the Caribbean has suffered, meaning that any treasure Roberts hid there might still be waiting, undiscovered because no one has thought to look. But the same obscurity means that the historical record is thin, with few documents that might provide clues about where Roberts went and what he did during his African operations. The Welsh connection in Roberts's story adds another dimension to the search for his treasure. Roberts was Welsh, as was Howell Davis, whose crew he joined, and Wales has occasionally been suggested as a possible repository for pirate wealth. The idea is romantic but implausible. Roberts left Wales as a young man and never returned, and there is no evidence that he sent money home or maintained connections with his birthplace. The village of Little Newcastle has embraced its famous son, with local history enthusiasts celebrating Roberts's career, but no one seriously suggests that treasure lies buried in the Welsh hills. The Welsh connection is part of Roberts's identity, helping to explain the unusual name that distinguished him from the English and Irish pirates who dominated the trade, but it does not provide a clue to where his fortune went. The modern technology that has revolutionized treasure hunting has been applied to the Roberts mystery with limited success. Metal detectors, ground-penetrating radar, and satellite imagery have all been used to search for pirate treasure in various locations, but no confirmed finds attributable to Roberts have resulted. The technology is effective at locating buried metal, but it cannot distinguish pirate gold from other sources, and false positives are common. A metal detector hit might indicate buried treasure, or it might indicate a colonial-era button, a 19th century coin, or a discarded bottle cap. Without documentary evidence pointing to a specific location, technology-based searching is essentially random, covering vast areas in hope of a lucky hit rather than investigating targeted sites where treasure is likely to be. The underwater archaeology that has recovered artifacts from shipwrecks offers another approach to Roberts's mystery. The wrecks of pirate ships are scattered across the Atlantic, some identified and some still awaiting discovery. The Wider Galley, the flagship of Samuel Bellamy that sank off Cape Cod in 1717, was discovered in 1984 and has yielded thousands of artifacts, including gold and silver that confirm the wealth of Golden Age pirates. The Royal Fortune, Roberts's flagship, was captured rather than sunk, so it does not offer a wreck site to explore. But other ships that Roberts took or that sailed with him may have sunk, carrying portions of the fleet's treasure to the bottom. The challenge is identifying which of the countless unidentified wrecks in the Atlantic might be connected to Roberts, a task that requires correlating historical records with underwater survey results. The Battle of Cape Lopez itself took place in waters that have never been systematically searched for artifacts. The items thrown overboard during the battle, including Roberts's body and whatever treasure the crew disposed of, would have sunk to the seafloor and remain there today. The water depth at the battle site is moderate, potentially accessible to diving operations, but the exact location of the engagement is not precisely known. Even if the battle site could be identified, the artifacts would be scattered by currents and buried by sediment, making recovery difficult and expensive. No serious archaeological expedition has attempted to search the Cape Lopez area, and the treasure that may lie there remains speculative rather than confirmed. The Príncipe Island, where Roberts's career as captain began with the revenge attack for Howell Davis's death, is another potential location for hidden treasure. Roberts and his crew looted the island thoroughly during the attack, and they may have cached some of their gains there for later recovery. The island is small and has been continuously inhabited, reducing the likelihood that buried treasure could have remained undiscovered for 3 centuries. But the volcanic landscape includes caves and rock formations that might provide hiding places, and the historical connection to Roberts makes the island a candidate for investigation. No confirmed treasure finds from Príncipe have been reported, but the island has not been systematically searched by professional archaeologists or treasure hunters. The Brazilian coast, scene of Roberts's spectacular capture of the Sagrada Família, offers yet another set of possibilities. The harbour of Bahia, where the theft occurred, was crowded and well documented, unlikely to contain hidden treasure. But the coast north of Bahia, where Roberts sailed after his coup, is less developed and less thoroughly explored. If Roberts hid some of the Brazilian treasure for safekeeping during his subsequent travels, the hiding place might be somewhere along this coast. The 40,000 gold moidores he captured from the Sagrada Família represented an enormous fortune. Even if most was spent or divided, a portion might have been set aside as a reserve. The Brazilian government has shown occasional interest in the Roberts treasure, but no organised search has been conducted. The Newfoundland coast, where Roberts attacked the fishing fleet at Trepassey, is an unlikely but not impossible location for hidden treasure. Roberts spent several days at Trepassey with ample time to explore the coastline and select a hiding place if he wished to cache some of his gains. The remote and rugged landscape offers countless locations where treasure could be concealed, and the cold climate might preserve artifacts that would decay in tropical environments. Against this possibility is the question of why Roberts would have hidden treasure in a location so far from his usual operating areas. Recovering cached goods from Newfoundland would have required a long voyage from the Caribbean or Africa, making it an impractical reserve. But pirates were not always practical, and Roberts may have had reasons that made sense to him, even if they seem strange to us. The popular culture representations of Roberts have fluctuated over the centuries, sometimes featuring him prominently and sometimes overshadowing him with pirates whose stories are more easily dramatized. The elegant tea-drinking captain makes for an unusual protagonist, lacking the visual drama of Blackbeard's smoking fuses or the romantic tragedy of Bonnie and Reed. Roberts's story is one of sustained success rather than dramatic moments, 400 captures that blur together rather than a single spectacular event. Writers and filmmakers have generally preferred pirates whose stories offer more obvious dramatic structure, leaving Roberts as a background figure known to historians but not to the general public. Captain Charles Johnson's General History, the primary source for Roberts's career, established the template that subsequent writers have followed. Johnson portrayed Roberts as intelligent, capable, and somewhat aloof, a leader who stood apart from his men even as he shared their enterprise. The crimson clothes, the tea-drinking, the religious observances all appear in Johnson's account and have been repeated by writers ever since. Johnson also established the basic narrative arc, from forced recruitment through Brazilian triumph to African nemesis, that structures most retellings of Roberts's story. Later writers have embellished and modified Johnson's account, but they have not fundamentally changed it. The Roberts we know is essentially Johnson's Roberts, filtered through 3 centuries of retelling. The 20th century brought Roberts into adventure fiction, where he appeared as a character in novels, films, and eventually video games. These appearances were usually minor, cameos by a famous name rather than central roles in the narrative. The Pirates of the Caribbean franchise, the most successful pirate entertainment of the modern era, includes references to Roberts's code but does not feature him as a character. Other pirate media have similarly used Roberts as flavour rather than focus, invoking his name to establish authenticity without giving him a starring role. The result is that Roberts is widely referenced but not widely known. People have heard of him without knowing his story, recognizing his name from lists of famous pirates without understanding what made him famous. The historiography of Roberts has evolved alongside changing academic interests. Maritime historians have studied his operations as examples of 18th century seafaring, analysing his tactics, logistics, and navigation. Economic historians have examined the impact of his depredations on Atlantic trade, calculating the costs he imposed and the disruptions he caused. Social historians have analysed his articles as evidence of pirate culture, comparing them with other pirate codes and with the regulations of legitimate vessels. Legal historians have studied the Cape Coast trials as examples of early modern criminal justice, examining the procedures and outcomes through the lens of due process and human rights. Each discipline has found something valuable in Roberts's story, mining it for insights into their particular area of interest. The Atlantic history approach that has transformed understanding of the early modern period has been particularly productive for understanding Roberts. Atlantic historians see the ocean not as a barrier between continents, but as a connector, a highway that linked Europe, Africa, and the Americas in networks of trade, migration, and cultural exchange. Roberts exemplified this Atlantic perspective, operating across the entire ocean basin rather than in any single region. His career touched 4 continents, his crew included men from throughout the Atlantic world, and his impact was felt wherever ships sailed. Understanding Roberts requires thinking at the Atlantic scale, seeing the ocean as his environment and the trading networks as his targets. This perspective has enriched understanding of what Roberts was doing and why it mattered, placing him in a broader context that earlier accounts had missed. The environmental history of Roberts's era provides another lens for understanding his career. The Atlantic Ocean in the early 18th century was a challenging environment, with weather patterns, currents, and seasons that shaped human activities. Roberts had to work within these environmental constraints, sailing with the winds, avoiding storms, and timing his movements to the seasonal rhythms that governed Atlantic shipping. The fish that drew fleets to Newfoundland, the hurricanes that threatened the Caribbean, the doldrums that becalmed ships near the equator all affected Roberts's operations. Environmental historians have traced these connections, showing how the natural world shaped the human drama that unfolded upon it. Roberts was not just a pirate, but an ecological actor, exploiting and adapting to environmental conditions that we are only beginning to understand. The memory of Roberts persists most strongly in Wales, where he is celebrated as a local hero despite, or perhaps because of, his criminal career. The small boy from Little Newcastle, who became the most successful pirate in history, represents a triumph over obscurity and poverty, a rejection of the limited options available to rural Welsh people in the 18th century. Welsh historians and enthusiasts have claimed Roberts as a national figure, finding in his story themes of independence, defiance, and excellence that resonate with Welsh identity. The facts that he left Wales young and never returned, that his crew was multinational rather than Welsh, and that his career consisted of robbery and murder do not diminish his appeal. If anything, they enhance it, making him an outlaw hero in the tradition of mythical figures who stood against oppression. The Roberts celebrated in Wales is partly historical and partly imagined, a figure who serves modern purposes regardless of what the real man may have been like. The flag that Roberts flew has become one of the most famous pirate images, though its design is less well known than the generic skull and crossbones. Roberts used several flag designs during his career, each conveying specific messages to those who saw them. One design showed Roberts himself standing on 2 skulls, labelled ABH and AMH, standing for a Barbadian's head and a Martinican's head, a threat specifically directed at those islands whose governors had offended him. Another design showed a figure holding an hourglass and a skeleton, symbolising the passage of time and the death that awaited those who resisted. These flags were not mere decoration but communication, conveying information about who Roberts was and what his intentions were. The study of pirate flags has become a minor academic specialty, with researchers analysing the symbolism and psychology behind the various designs. The black flag itself, the symbol of piracy that transcends any individual pirate, owes its iconic status partly to Roberts and his contemporaries. Before the Golden Age, there was no standard pirate symbol. Ships signalled their hostile intent through various means without a recognised convention. The Golden Age pirates standardized the black flag as a warning, creating a brand identity that communicated a consistent message regardless of who was flying it. Seeing a black flag meant that the approaching ship was a pirate, that surrender was advisable, and that resistance would be punished. Roberts contributed to this standardization, flying recognizable variants of the black flag throughout his career and helping to establish the conventions that later pirates would follow. The skull and crossbones, the Jolly Roger in its classic form, emerged from this period as the definitive pirate symbol, recognized worldwide even by people who know nothing else about piracy. The red flag that indicated no quarter was equally important, though less celebrated. Roberts flew the red flag when he intended to give no mercy, when the target had offended him, or when he wished to maximize terror. The threat was real. Prisoners taken under the red flag could expect death regardless of their behavior. The gradation from black to red created a system of escalating threat that encouraged quick surrender. A ship that saw the black flag might still escape destruction by yielding immediately, while one that saw the red flag knew that their fate was sealed. This flag-based communication system was efficient and effective, conveying complex messages through simple visual signals that everyone in the Atlantic world understood. The weapons that Roberts and his crew used were state-of-the-art for their time, the same weapons that equipped legitimate naval and merchant vessels. Cannon of various sizes formed the primary armament of pirate ships, capable of damaging or sinking targets from a distance. The pirates preferred to intimidate rather than destroy their prizes, since a sunken ship yielded no plunder, but they were prepared to fight when necessary. Small arms, including pistols, muskets, and blunderbusses, equipped the crew for close combat during boarding actions. Cutlasses, the short-curved swords that are synonymous with pirates in popular imagination, served as primary weapons in the hand-to-hand fighting that decided contested boardings. The combination of firepower and steel made a well-equipped pirate crew formidable, capable of overwhelming merchant ships that were armed primarily for defense rather than offense. The ships that Roberts commanded evolved over his career as he captured larger and better vessels. He began with the small ships that Davis had commanded, adequate for coastal raiding but limited in range and firepower. The capture of the Sagrada Família in Brazil provided a major upgrade, a 40-gun ship capable of engaging naval vessels as well as merchantmen. Subsequent captures added to the fleet, giving Roberts the ability to deploy multiple ships for reconnaissance, pursuit, and combined attack. The Royal Fortune, the flagship aboard which he died, was the largest and most powerful vessel he ever commanded, a formidable warship that could have stood against all but the most powerful naval opposition. The progression from small raider to fleet commander reflected Roberts's growing success and his expanding ambitions. The maintenance of these ships required skills and supplies that Roberts acquired through capture and coercion. Carpenters, sailmakers, and other skilled craftsmen were pressed into service when captured, their talents too valuable to release. Spare sails, rope, timber, tar, and other materials were taken from prizes, ensuring that the pirate fleet could repair damage and replace worn equipment. The careening necessary to clean hulls and maintain speed was conducted in secluded anchorages, where the ships could be hauled onto beaches and the tedious work accomplished without interruption. Roberts managed these logistical challenges with the same competence he applied to everything else, ensuring that his ships remained operational through months and years of continuous cruising. The navigation that guided Roberts across the Atlantic relied on instruments and techniques that were standard for the era. The compass provided direction, the sextant or earlier instruments provided latitude, and dead reckoning estimated distance travelled. Longitude remained problematic, determined by calculation rather than direct measurement until the development of accurate chronometers later in the century. Charts of varying reliability guided ships through unfamiliar waters, while local knowledge from experienced sailors supplemented the written information. Roberts navigated successfully across all of the Atlantic's diverse waters, from the cold fogs of Newfoundland to the tropical heat of West Africa, demonstrating skill that would have been impressive in any captain, pirate, or legitimate. The diseases that afflicted Roberts's crew were the same that afflicted all sailors of the era, with the addition of tropical illnesses encountered in the Caribbean and Africa. Scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency during long voyages without fresh food, weakened men and could kill if untreated. Malaria and yellow fever, endemic in tropical regions, struck down sailors who had no immunity. Dysentery, typhus, and other infections spread quickly in the crowded, unsanitary conditions aboard ship. The ship's surgeon, often a pressed man with varying levels of competence, provided whatever treatment was possible with the limited medical knowledge and supplies available. Roberts's articles provided for injury compensation, but made no specific provision for illness, reflecting the distinction between wounds earned in battle and sickness that struck randomly. The constant attrition from disease meant that crews needed constant replenishment, one of the reasons that pirates actively recruited from captured vessels. The food that sustained Roberts's crew ranged from adequate to terrible, depending on circumstances. Fresh food was consumed quickly after any landfall, with meat, vegetables, and fruit eaten while they remained edible. Once at sea, the diet devolved to preserved provisions: salt beef and pork, hardtack biscuits, dried peas, and whatever else could survive without refrigeration. The quality deteriorated over time, with meat becoming rancid, biscuits becoming infested with weevils, and water becoming brackish. Pirates ate better than most sailors because they could take fresh provisions from prizes, supplementing their stored supplies with whatever their victims had been carrying. Roberts's articles guaranteed equal access to fresh provisions, ensuring that the captain ate the same food as the men, a levelling that distinguished pirate ships from vessels where officers dined well while crews went hungry. The water that crews depended upon was stored in wooden casks that imparted flavours and fostered bacterial growth. Fresh water was a constant concern, driving ships to seek landfalls where rivers or springs could replenish supplies. The brackish foul water that resulted from long storage was barely drinkable, which is one reason that sailors drank so much rum, wine, and beer. Alcoholic beverages were safer than water and more palatable. Roberts's preference for tea was unusual in this context, since tea required boiling water that was itself safer than untreated ship's water. His sobriety may thus have had health benefits that he did not consciously recognize, protecting him from the alcoholism that damaged so many sailors and from the waterborne diseases that foul water transmitted. The sleeping arrangements aboard ship were cramped and uncomfortable, with common sailors sharing limited space while officers had marginally better accommodations. Hammocks suspended from beams provided beds that swung with the ship's motion, tolerable when accustomed to but never truly comfortable. Privacy was non-existent. Men slept, ate, and lived in constant proximity to their shipmates, with all the friction that such closeness produced. The watches that divided the crew into shifts provided some relief, with half the men on duty at any time while the others rested. But the schedule was demanding, and truly restful sleep was rare. The curfew in Roberts's articles, requiring lights out at 8 o'clock, was partly an attempt to impose a rhythm that would allow adequate rest, recognizing that exhausted men made poor sailors and worse fighters. The entertainment available to pirates was limited to what they could create or carry aboard ship. Music was important, with the musicians required by Roberts's articles providing a soundtrack for work and leisure alike. Singing, storytelling, and conversation passed the time during idle hours. Gambling was popular despite its prohibition in Roberts's articles, with men risking their shares on games of chance that could leave them wealthy or destitute. Drinking was the primary recreation. The rum ration expanded into a constant consumption that kept many pirates in a state of permanent inebriation. The shore leaves that punctuated long voyages offered access to taverns, brothels, and other commercial entertainments that pirates patronized with the enthusiasm of men who might die before the next opportunity. Roberts's crew, like all pirates, alternated between the tedium of shipboard routine and the excesses of time ashore. The justice that Roberts administered through his articles and his personal authority maintained order in circumstances that would otherwise have descended into chaos. Disputes were resolved through the mechanisms the articles specified: duels for personal quarrels, votes for collective decisions, punishments prescribed for specific offences. The quartermaster served as chief justice for most purposes, hearing complaints and rendering judgments that the captain could override only in limited circumstances. The system worked because everyone had agreed to it. The articles were a social contract that bound all who signed them, creating legitimate authority in a community that had rejected all other authority. Roberts himself was the supreme arbiter, his decisions final on matters where the articles were ambiguous or silent. His personal authority rested on his success, his competence, and his force of personality. Men obeyed him because he had earned obedience, not because any higher power had appointed him. The religion that Roberts practiced and encouraged was conventional Christianity of the Protestant variety, compatible with his Welsh upbringing if anomalous for a pirate captain. The services he held aboard ship would have been recognisable to any churchgoer of the era, with prayers, scripture readings and hymns performed according to traditional forms. The Sabbath observance that his articles specified set his ships apart from others, where every day was the same, imposing a weekly rhythm that connected the pirates to the broader Christian world they had left behind. The paradox of pious pirates has fascinated commentators, who note that men who robbed and killed could also pray and sing hymns without apparent cognitive dissonance. Roberts himself seems to have seen no contradiction, treating religion as a separate domain from piracy, one not affecting the other. The economy of piracy that Roberts mastered was more complex than simple theft, involving networks of exchange, credit, and corruption that connected the pirate world to the legitimate one. Pirates could not simply pile up gold and live on it. They needed to convert their plunder into usable goods and services, which required commerce with those who were willing to trade. Merchants in certain ports specialized in this trade, buying stolen goods at discounted prices and selling provisions, equipment, and entertainment to pirates who had money to spend. Corrupt officials facilitated these exchanges, accepting bribes to look the other way while illegal commerce proceeded. The entire system depended on the willingness of legitimate actors to participate in the pirate economy, profiting from the disorder, even as they publicly condemned it. Roberts navigated this grey economy with skill, finding the ports and people who would do business with him, and avoiding those who might betray him to the authorities. His intelligence network included informants in colonial towns who reported on naval movements and commercial opportunities, allowing him to stay ahead of his pursuers and to position his ships where prizes would be found. The information asymmetry that gave him advantages over his victims also gave him advantages over the authorities. He knew more about what they were doing than they knew about what he was doing. This information management was as important to his success as his courage and seamanship, allowing him to make decisions based on knowledge rather than guessing. The corruption that enabled piracy extended to the highest levels of colonial government. Governors who were supposed to suppress pirates sometimes protected them instead, accepting bribes or shares of plunder in exchange for safe harbour and warnings about naval movements. The extent of official complicity is difficult to determine, since both pirates and officials had reasons to conceal their dealings, but occasional scandals reveal that corruption was widespread. Roberts reportedly had arrangements with officials in certain ports, understanding that money paid in the right places would buy protection that force alone could not provide. The moral boundaries between pirate and official were permeable. Men moved back and forth across them as circumstances changed, pirates becoming governors and governors protecting pirates. The slaves that Roberts encountered aboard captured ships occupied a complex position in the pirate world. The slave trade was a primary target of pirate attacks, not because pirates opposed slavery, but because slave ships carried valuable cargo in both directions. Enslaved Africans being transported to the Americas were potential recruits for pirate crews, potential labourers for pirate operations, or potential merchandise to be sold to the same buyers who would have received them anyway. The pirates' treatment of enslaved people varied widely. Some were freed and offered places on the crew, some were pressed into service as sailors or servants, some were sold back into slavery, and some died in the confusion of capture and its aftermath. Roberts's attitudes towards slavery are not recorded, but his operations intersected with the slave trade constantly, and his crew included men of African descent whose paths to piracy had passed through the Middle Passage. The women who appear in Roberts's story are few and marginal, reflecting both the prohibition in his articles and the general absence of women from Golden Age pirate crews. The prohibition against women was practical rather than ideological, designed to prevent the conflicts that arose when men competed for female attention. Roberts himself had no known romantic attachments. If he had a wife or lover, she left no trace in the historical record. The women he encountered were victims, passengers on captured ships who faced uncertain fates depending on their status and the mood of their captors. Roberts's articles specified death for anyone who smuggled a woman aboard in disguise, the extreme penalty indicating how seriously he took the threat that women's presence posed to crew cohesion. The Golden Age pirate world was overwhelmingly male, and Roberts's ships were no exception. The children who served aboard Roberts's ships were also present despite their nominal exclusion from his articles. Boys served on naval and merchant ships of the era, learning seamanship as apprentices and cabin servants, and pirate ships followed similar patterns. Young boys captured from prizes might be pressed into service or taken along as servants. Boys who joined voluntarily might begin their pirate careers at ages that would shock modern sensibilities. The prohibition against boys in Roberts's articles may have referred to sexual exploitation rather than to employment, attempting to prevent practices that were known to occur on some ships. Or the prohibition may have been honoured mainly in the breach, a formal rule that did not prevent the actual presence of youths aboard. The evidence is too thin to be certain about the role of young people in Roberts's crew. The old men who served with Roberts were rare, reflecting the short life expectancy of pirates and the physical demands of the profession. Piracy favoured the young and strong, men who could climb rigging, haul ropes and fight with cutlass and pistol. Those who survived to middle age often retired if they could, their accumulated shares providing a nest egg for a quieter life on shore. The few older men who remained at sea brought experience and knowledge that younger men lacked, but they also brought the accumulated injuries and illnesses of maritime life. Roberts himself was only about 40 when he died, an age that would have been considered past prime for physical labour. His career was compressed into 3 years, from age 37 to 40, a final act rather than a life's work. The young men who sailed with him were even younger, most in their 20s, expecting to live fast and die young. The final months of Roberts's career, from his arrival in Africa in 1721 to his death in February 1722, were the most productive and the most dangerous of his life. The African coast provided targets in abundance, but it also brought him within reach of Captain Ogle and the Swallow. The captures mounted week after week, pushing Roberts's total toward the 400 ships that would make him the most prolific pirate in history. Each capture added to his wealth, his reputation, and his danger. The more successful he became, the more determined the authorities were to stop him. The convergence was inevitable. A pirate who operated openly, who attacked without discrimination, who boasted of his immunity from consequences, would eventually encounter someone capable of delivering those consequences. For Roberts, that someone was Ogle. The irony of Roberts's death is that it resulted from a moment of carelessness in a career otherwise characterized by careful preparation. He allowed his ships to be caught at anchor, separated and vulnerable, by an enemy he should have detected before it was too late. His lookouts failed him, or perhaps he'd grown complacent after months of unchallenged dominance. The crew was tired and restless, their attention degraded by the boredom and tension of continuous cruising. The discipline that Roberts had maintained was slipping, evidenced by the drinking that left many men incapacitated when the battle began. All the factors that Roberts had managed so skillfully for 3 years aligned against him in the end, creating the conditions for disaster that Ogle exploited with professional competence. The battle itself lasted only hours. The combat decided quickly once Roberts fell. A crew that had been prepared to fight to the death discovered that their willingness depended on their captain's presence. With him gone, the fighting spirit evaporated, replaced by the instinct for self-preservation that the black flag was supposed to override. The surrender that followed was ignominious for men who had prided themselves on fearlessness, but it was also rational. Dead pirates gained nothing, while living pirates might escape the noose through luck or persuasion. The 264 men captured represented the largest haul of pirates in history, a bounty that would make Ogle's reputation and break the back of Atlantic piracy for a generation. The treasure that should have been aboard the captured ships was conspicuously absent. The Navy searched thoroughly, motivated by the prize money that captured goods would generate, but found far less than they expected. The discrepancy between what Roberts must have accumulated and what was recovered has fueled speculation ever since. The explanations offered, spending, dispersal, concealment, destruction, all have merit, but none fully accounts for the missing fortune. The mystery remains, 300 years later, an unsolved puzzle that continues to attract treasure hunters and historians alike. The possibility that some of Roberts's treasure remains hidden, waiting to be discovered, is small, but not zero. The conditions required for survival of buried treasure are specific: a container that protects against decay and corrosion, a location that remains undisturbed by natural and human processes, and enough luck to avoid the random events that destroy most buried objects. 3 centuries of exposure to these threats would have eliminated most treasure that was hidden in 1720, but some might have survived in ideal conditions. A chest buried in dry sand, a cache hidden in a cave, a strong box concealed in a building that was subsequently abandoned, all might theoretically have preserved their contents to the present day. The chances are slim, but they are not zero, and the allure of pirate gold is sufficient to motivate searching despite the long odds. The lessons of Roberts's career extend beyond the immediate details of piracy to broader questions of leadership, organisation, and risk. He demonstrated that unconventional enterprises could be managed effectively, that democratic governance could maintain order among violent men, that careful planning could achieve results that seemed impossible. His success was not random luck, but the product of intelligence, discipline, and skill applied consistently over time. The eventual failure, the carelessness that cost him his life, illustrates that sustained excellence is difficult, that even the most capable leaders eventually make mistakes, that luck runs out for everyone. Roberts was not superhuman. He was a capable man who performed at a high level for an extended period, and then, in one critical moment, fell short. The search for Roberts's treasure continues in various forms, from amateur hunters with metal detectors to professional researchers with archival sources. The Caribbean islands that Roberts cruised have been searched countless times without significant finds. The African coast that he worked in his final year remains less explored, with possibilities that have not been eliminated. The archives that might contain clues, the trial records and newspaper accounts and private correspondence of the era, have been examined but perhaps not exhaustively. Someone someday might find the document or the physical evidence that resolves the mystery, pointing to a location that no one has thought to search. Or the mystery might endure forever, the treasure dispersed beyond recovery, the secret of its location dying with the men who knew it. The crew members who survived the battle and the trials left their own traces in history, providing glimpses of what happened to Golden Age pirates who escaped the noose. Some were acquitted, having persuaded the court that they had been forced to serve and had participated minimally in pirate activities. These men returned to whatever lives they could construct, carrying memories of their pirate years but speaking of them rarely or not at all. Some were convicted of lesser offences and sentenced to terms of service in the Navy or transportation to penal colonies, punishments that were harsh but survivable. A few may have escaped entirely, slipping away from Cape Coast before the trial or evading capture during the battle. The fate of most is unknown, their names recorded in the trial documents and then disappearing from history. The handful of men who achieved prominence after surviving Roberts's crew provide unusual windows into the pirate experience. Some testified at the trials, providing information about Roberts's operations that has become part of the historical record. Their testimony must be treated carefully, since men facing execution had strong incentives to minimize their own involvement and blame others, but it provides details that no other source preserves. The descriptions of Roberts's articles, his personal habits, and his final battle all derive partly from testimony given by men who had sailed with him and who now sought to save their lives by cooperating with the authorities. The impact of the Cape Coast trials on Atlantic piracy was substantial, demonstrating that the authorities were now serious about suppression and that capture meant death for most who were taken. The Golden Age had persisted partly because pirates believed they could escape consequences, that pardons would be offered, that corrupt officials would protect them, that they could retire with their earnings before the Navy caught up. The mass executions at Cape Coast challenged all these assumptions, showing that piracy was now treated as the capital crime it had always technically been. Pirates who learned of the fate of Roberts's crew had reason to reconsider their career choices, and many did, accepting pardons or retiring while they still could. The symbolic importance of Roberts's death extended beyond its practical effects. He had been the greatest pirate of the age, the man who had captured more ships than anyone else, who had operated with apparent impunity for 3 years, who had taunted the governors and defied the Navy. His death signalled that even the greatest pirates could be brought down, that no one was beyond the reach of law and force when they were properly applied. The news spread throughout the Atlantic world, reported in newspapers and discussed in taverns, changing the perception of piracy from invincible menace to vulnerable criminality. The psychological shift was as important as the practical one. Pirates who had felt themselves masters of the sea now felt themselves hunted prey. The romance of Roberts's story, despite its violent content, has contributed to the enduring fascination with Golden Age piracy. The elegant clothes, the tea drinking, the religious observances, the dramatic death in battle, all provide elements that later storytellers have used to construct pirate narratives that are more complex than simple tales of robbery and murder. Roberts was not a cartoon villain, but a complicated figure whose motivations and character resist easy categorization. He was forced into piracy but embraced it. He was ruthless toward enemies but governed his crew with recognizable fairness. He dressed in silk but drank tea instead of rum. He held religious services but killed without apparent remorse. These contradictions make him interesting, a figure who defies the stereotypes while embodying them, who represents both the reality and the myth of the Golden Age. The treasure that nobody found remains the final mystery, the question that cannot be answered with available evidence. Did Roberts bury a fortune somewhere along his route, planning to recover it someday and retire in comfort? Did he hide wealth aboard his ships in compartments that the Navy never discovered? Did he spend everything as fast as he earned it, the legendary fortune existing only in imagination? Did his trusted officers know secrets that died with them at Cape Coast, locations and methods that could have led to recovery if anyone had survived to reveal them? The questions multiply without resolution, each possible answer generating new questions of its own. The night has grown deep, and we have followed Bartholomew Roberts from his Welsh birthplace to his watery grave off the coast of Africa. We have seen him rise from forced recruit to supreme commander, from obscure sailor to the most successful pirate in history. We have examined his articles, his tactics, his personality, and his legacy. We have considered the mystery of his missing treasure, the fortune that 400 ships should have produced but that was never found. The story is complete, but the mystery remains, waiting for someone to solve it or waiting to remain unsolved forever. The sea that Roberts sailed still rolls beneath the same stars that guided his navigation. The coasts he cruised still hold their secrets, whether empty or laden with hidden gold. The archives that recorded his deeds still yield occasional discoveries, documents overlooked or newly accessible that add details to what we know. The search continues, as it has continued for 3 centuries, driven by curiosity and greed in measures that vary from searcher to searcher. Perhaps someday the treasure will be found, confirming the legends and rewarding persistence. Perhaps it will never be found, remaining a mystery that enhances the legend rather than resolving it. Either way, the story of Bartholomew Roberts endures, a tale of ambition and violence and wealth and death that speaks across the centuries to anyone who will listen. The ships that Roberts captured over his career represent a catalogue of Atlantic commerce in the early 18th century. Slave ships carrying human cargo from Africa to the Americas fell to his guns, their holds filled with suffering that the pirates did not create but did not prevent. Sugar ships carrying the product of Caribbean plantations to European markets were taken, their sweet cargoes funding the pirate enterprise. Tobacco ships, rum ships, ships carrying manufactured goods from Europe to the colonies, ships carrying fish from the Newfoundland banks, ships carrying gold and silver from the mines of Brazil and Spanish America, all contributed to Roberts's total. The 400 captures were not merely a number but a cross-section of the Atlantic economy, a sample of everything that moved across the ocean in that era. The value of these captures, if it could be calculated precisely, would reveal the scale of Roberts's impact on Atlantic commerce. Each ship taken represented not only its cargo but its vessel, its equipment, its provisions and the labour of its crew. Ships that were destroyed rather than released represented permanent losses to their owners, capital eliminated from the trading system. Ships that were released after looting still suffered losses of time, cargo and confidence, their voyages disrupted and their schedules broken. The cumulative impact of 400 such incidents would have been substantial, imposing costs on merchants, insurers and consumers throughout the Atlantic world. The insurance industry that covered Atlantic shipping was directly affected by Roberts's depredations. Premiums rose when pirate activity increased, reflecting the higher probability of loss. Merchants who could not afford insurance or could not obtain it at any price faced the full risk themselves, potentially ruinous if their ships were taken. The uncertainty that piracy created disrupted planning and investment, making merchants reluctant to commit capital to ventures that might never return a profit. Roberts, operating at the scale he did, was not merely stealing from individual victims, but imposing systemic costs on the entire commercial network, a negative externality that affected everyone who participated in Atlantic trade. The colonial economies that depended on Atlantic shipping suffered correspondingly. Plantations that could not ship their sugar or tobacco could not earn the income that sustained their operations. Merchants who could not obtain supplies from Europe could not stock their shops or supply their customers. The flow of goods that colonial economies required was interrupted by pirate activity, creating shortages and price increases that affected everyone. Colonial governors who wrote to London complaining about pirates were not merely concerned with law and order. They were concerned with the economic health of their colonies, which depended on the commerce that pirates disrupted. The metropolitan economies of Europe also felt the impact, though less directly. Merchants in London, Bristol, Liverpool, Amsterdam, and other trading centres depended on the safe arrival of ships they had invested in. Manufacturers who produced goods for colonial markets needed those markets to remain accessible. The returns that funded European investment in Atlantic ventures were reduced when piracy took a portion of the value that should have flowed back across the ocean. The entire system of Atlantic commerce, the network of production, trade and consumption that connected 4 continents, was less efficient and less profitable because of pirates like Roberts. The navy that eventually destroyed Roberts was the instrument of these economic interests, funded by merchants and taxpayers who demanded protection for their commerce. The decision to assign ships like the Swallow to anti-piracy patrols reflected a judgment that the costs of naval deployment were justified by the benefits of reduced piracy. Captain Ogle's mission was not adventure but business, an investment of naval resources expected to yield returns in the form of safer commerce and reduced insurance premiums. The capture of Roberts was thus an economic as well as a military victory, removing a threat to commerce and demonstrating that investment in naval protection could produce results. The broader history of piracy suppression in the 18th century followed the pattern established by Ogle's victory. Naval patrols became more numerous and more effective as colonial powers invested in protecting their commerce. Pirates found fewer safe harbours as governors came under pressure to enforce laws they had previously ignored. The opportunities for successful piracy diminished as the risks increased, making the profession less attractive to men who calculated the expected returns. By the late 1720s, the Golden Age was effectively over, ended by the economic and military responses that Roberts's success had helped to provoke. The legacy of this suppression extended beyond the immediate reduction in piracy. The Atlantic became safer for commerce, encouraging investment and expansion that might otherwise have been deterred. The trade networks that connected continents grew denser and more efficient, carrying more goods and people than ever before. The naval power that had been developed to fight pirates was available for other purposes, including the wars between European powers that would dominate the rest of the century. The Golden Age of piracy was a brief disruption in the long-term trend toward integration and control, an episode that revealed both the vulnerabilities of the Atlantic system and its capacity to respond to threats. The personal legacy of Bartholomew Roberts is harder to assess. He left no children, no memoirs, no property that descended to heirs. The fortune he accumulated vanished, benefiting no one who can be identified. His crew was killed, captured, or dispersed, their connections to him severed by death and distance. What remains is the record, the documented history of a man who rose from obscurity to infamy and then died in the prime of his career. The record is substantial, more complete than for most pirates, but it reveals a man rather than a life, actions rather than inner experience. Who Roberts really was, what he thought and felt and believed, remains largely unknown, hidden behind the mask of crimson silk and gold chains that he presented to the world. The diamond cross that Roberts wore around his neck when he died has become one of the most evocative images of Golden Age piracy, a symbol of the wealth and contradiction that characterized the man. Diamonds were among the most valuable commodities of the era, concentrated repositories of wealth that could be carried on the body and hidden easily. A single large diamond could be worth more than an ordinary sailor would earn in a lifetime, and Roberts's cross contained multiple stones set in gold. The image of a pirate captain wearing such a treasure while commanding ships and fighting battles combines the sacred and the profane, the material and the spiritual, in ways that capture the complexity of pirate culture. The cross itself was religious symbolism, the central image of Christianity that Roberts's faith would have made meaningful to him. That he wore it while robbing and killing suggests either profound hypocrisy or a view of religion that separated faith from morality in ways that modern sensibilities find difficult to understand. Roberts may have believed, as many of his contemporaries did, that faith in Christ was what mattered for salvation, not good works, and that a believing pirate was saved while an unbelieving merchant was damned. or he may have compartmentalized his life, practicing religion on Sundays and piracy on weekdays without allowing one to interfere with the other. The cross around his neck was a statement about his identity, declaring that he was a Christian even as he violated Christian commandments. The diamonds set in the cross were statements of a different kind, displaying wealth that Roberts had accumulated through successful piracy. Wearing such valuable jewellery was risky. The crew might have resented the captain's ostentation while they wore rags, but Roberts's success gave him the authority to indulge in displays that a less successful captain could not have afforded. The diamonds declared that Roberts had earned his position, that his leadership had produced wealth beyond what ordinary pirates could expect. They were credentials as much as ornaments, proof of competence that reinforced the respect that Roberts had earned through his actions. The loss of the cross when Roberts's body was thrown overboard adds poignancy to the image. The diamonds that had adorned the living captain sank with the dead one, treasure lost to the sea rather than captured by the enemy. The crew's decision to bury Roberts with his jewels rather than stripping them first reflects either devotion to their captain's wishes or the chaos of battle that prevented more calculated disposal. Either way, the cross is gone, resting somewhere on the Atlantic floor where it fell 3 centuries ago, a tangible piece of Roberts's treasure that no one will ever recover. The search for Roberts's diamond cross specifically, as distinct from his general treasure, has attracted occasional interest. Divers have wondered whether the cross might be recoverable, lying in waters shallow enough to reach and distinct enough to identify. The challenges are formidable. The battle site is not precisely located. Currents would have scattered objects over a wide area, sediment would have buried most items, and 3 centuries of exposure would have damaged even gold and diamonds. But the image of finding Roberts's personal treasure, the cross he wore when he died, is compelling enough to motivate occasional expeditions to the waters off Cape Lopez. None has succeeded, and none is likely to succeed, but the search continues because the image is irresistible. The night grows quieter now, and the story of Bartholomew Roberts draws toward its end. We have traced his entire career from the Welsh village where he was born to the African waters where he died. We have examined his methods and his motives, his successes and his failure. We have considered the treasure he accumulated and the mystery of where it went. We have reflected on his legacy, the influence he had on pirate culture, and on the Atlantic world that he terrorized for 3 years. The man in crimson silk with his tea and his Bible and his diamond cross remains an enigmatic figure, knowable through his actions but unknowable in his inner life. The treasure that nobody found may be everywhere and nowhere, dispersed through the Atlantic economy in ways that can never be traced, or concentrated in some hiding place that has never been discovered. The 400 ships that Roberts captured yielded wealth beyond calculation, yet almost nothing tangible remains. The gold was spent or hidden or lost. The goods were consumed or sold. The ships were broken up or scattered. What survives is the story, the record of a career that lasted 3 years and changed history, the legend of a pirate who rose higher and fell faster than any other. Sleep now as the waves roll and the stars turn overhead, the same waves and stars that Roberts knew in his time upon the sea. The mysteries remain unsolved, the treasure unfound, the questions unanswered. But the story has been told, and perhaps in dreams you will sail those waters yourself, imagining what it was like to fly the black flag and take what you wanted from a world that had nothing else to offer. The pirates are gone now, their age ended by the forces that Roberts helped to provoke. But their stories survive, told and retold across the centuries, keeping alive the memory of men who chose freedom over safety and paid the price that freedom demanded. Good night, and may your dreams be rich with pirate gold and adventure on the high seas. Good night. The weather of the Atlantic shaped every aspect of Roberts's operations, dictating when and where he could sail, which targets he could pursue, and what dangers he faced beyond the human opponents who hunted him. The trade winds that blew from Africa toward the Americas carried ships westward efficiently, but made the return journey difficult. The westerlies of the North Atlantic carried ships eastward, but could become fierce storms that overwhelmed even the best prepared vessels. The hurricanes that swept through the Caribbean during the summer and fall months were a constant threat, capable of destroying entire fleets without warning. Roberts navigated these meteorological realities with the skill of an experienced seaman, using the winds when they favoured him and seeking shelter when they turned dangerous. The seasonal patterns of Atlantic shipping created opportunities that Roberts exploited systematically. The treasure fleets from Brazil sailed at predictable times, laden with the year's accumulation of gold and diamonds. The fishing fleets gathered off Newfoundland in the summer months when the cod were running. The slave ships loaded on the African coast during the dry season, when conditions for the Middle Passage were least deadly. Roberts positioned his forces to intercept these seasonal movements, appearing where the prizes would be richest and the opposition weakest. His timing was precise, reflecting knowledge of Atlantic patterns that he had accumulated during his years in legitimate maritime service. The storms that Roberts survived during his career must have been numerous, though few are recorded in detail. Any ship operating in the Atlantic for 3 years would have encountered multiple severe weather events, occasions when the crew's survival depended on seamanship and luck. Roberts's ships were maintained well enough to weather these storms, a testament to the discipline he imposed on maintenance and the skills of the carpenters and sailmakers who kept the fleet operational. The loss of ships to weather, always possible despite the best precautions, would have set back his operations and reduced his force, but no such losses are prominently recorded in the sources. Either Roberts was extraordinarily lucky with weather, or he was extraordinarily skilled at avoiding the worst conditions, or the losses simply went unrecorded in the partial documentation that survives. The currents of the Atlantic were as important as the winds, carrying ships along predictable paths that sailors had learned to exploit over centuries of navigation. The Gulf Stream swept up the American coast and across toward Europe, accelerating ships that rode it and impeding those that fought against it. The Canary Current flowed down the African coast toward the equator, carrying ships toward the Cape Verde Islands and the trade wind crossing. Roberts used these currents as he used the winds, positioning his ships where the traffic would flow and where pursuit would be difficult. A pirate who understood currents could gain advantages over naval vessels whose commanders were less familiar with local waters, appearing and disappearing in ways that seemed almost magical to those who did not understand the oceanography. The navigation techniques that Roberts employed were state-of-the-art for his era, though limited by the technology available. Latitude could be determined with reasonable accuracy using the sun or stars, but longitude remained problematic, calculated through dead reckoning that accumulated errors over long voyages. Charts of varying quality provided information about coastlines and hazards, but unmarked dangers still claimed ships that strayed from known routes. Roberts navigated successfully across the entire Atlantic, from Brazil to Newfoundland to Africa, demonstrating mastery of the available techniques and willingness to venture into waters that other pirates avoided. His navigation skills were among the factors that made his extraordinary range of operations possible. The coastlines that Roberts cruised were diverse, from the tropical shores of Brazil and Africa to the cold, fog-bound rocks of Newfoundland. Each coast presented different challenges: coral reefs in the Caribbean, sandbars off Africa, icebergs in the North Atlantic. Local knowledge was essential for safe navigation, and Roberts acquired it through experience and through the forced recruitment of sailors who knew waters he did not. The pilots who guided ships through dangerous passages were valuable additions to his crew, their expertise potentially saving the ship from disasters that could end the enterprise entirely. Roberts collected human expertise as he collected treasure, recognizing that knowledge was as valuable as gold for maintaining his operations. The harbours that Roberts used for resupply, repair and rest were scattered throughout his operational area, selected for their combination of safety, accessibility and discretion. Some were colonial ports where corrupt officials could be bribed to overlook pirate activity. Others were remote anchorages where ships could careen and repair without interference. Still others were established pirate haunts where the infrastructure for servicing outlaw vessels had developed over years. Roberts's ability to operate continuously for 3 years depended on access to these facilities, places where his ships could be maintained and his crews could recuperate. The loss of access to such facilities, through increased naval patrols or tightened colonial administration, would eventually contribute to the decline of piracy that Roberts's success helped to accelerate. The food supplies that sustained Roberts's crew came from multiple sources, each with advantages and limitations. Provisions from captured ships were free but unpredictable, depending on what each prize happened to be carrying. Purchases from corrupt merchants provided more reliable supply but required money and exposed the pirates to potential betrayal. Fishing and hunting supplemented stored provisions when opportunities arose. The combination of these sources kept the crew fed, if not always well fed, through months and years of continuous operation. Roberts's articles guaranteeing equal access to provisions ensured that all shared equally in whatever food was available, preventing the hoarding and favouritism that could divide a crew. The medical care available to Roberts's crew was limited by the knowledge and supplies of the era. Ship surgeons, whether pressed or voluntary, could treat wounds, amputate damaged limbs, and provide comfort to the dying, but they could not prevent the infections that killed many who survived initial injuries. Diseases that swept through crews had no effective treatment. Men either recovered or died, with medicine doing little to affect the outcome. Roberts's articles providing compensation for injuries recognised that medical care was inadequate, offering financial support to replace the physical restoration that no one could provide. The disability payments were acknowledgement that the enterprise would break bodies, and that those broken bodies deserved support from the enterprise that had broken them. The rum that Roberts refused but his crew consumed was the defining beverage of the Atlantic pirate world, distilled from the sugar that Caribbean plantations produced in abundance. Rum was cheap, potent and portable, perfect for shipboard consumption where water went bad and beer took too much space. The daily rum ration that was standard on naval and merchant ships became unlimited consumption on pirate vessels, where men could drink as much as they wanted whenever they wanted. The results were predictable: chronic drunkenness that impaired judgment, fights that injured and killed, hangovers that reduced effectiveness for days afterward. Roberts's sobriety was an exception that proved the rule. Most pirates drank and many died because of it. The contrast between Roberts's tea and his crew's rum illustrated the different approaches to pirate life that coexisted within the same enterprise. Roberts treated piracy as a profession to be pursued with discipline and clear-headedness, maximising returns through careful planning and calculated risk-taking. His crew treated piracy as an escape from the constraints of legitimate life, an opportunity to indulge appetites that had been suppressed under naval and merchant discipline. Both approaches could succeed, and both did succeed under Roberts's leadership. The combination of his strategic vision and their tactical ferocity produced the most successful pirate operation in history. But the tension between discipline and indulgence was always present, surfacing in the restlessness that plagued the African crews and the drunkenness that impaired the crew at Cape Lopez. The women of the ports where pirates found entertainment were essential to the pirate economy, though they appear only marginally in the historical record. Prostitutes, tavern keepers, laundresses, and others provided services that pirates paid for with the gold they had stolen. These women extracted wealth from the pirate economy and recycled it into the legitimate economy, converting stolen goods into labour and commerce. They were not pirates themselves, but depended on pirates for their income, occupying an ambiguous position between the outlaw world and the respectable one. Roberts's prohibition against women aboard ship did not prevent his crew from patronising women ashore, and the ports they visited were equipped to serve their needs. The children who grew up in port towns frequented by pirates absorbed attitudes and expectations that shaped their own futures. Boys who watched pirates swagger through town with gold in their pockets and weapons at their sides might dream of similar careers, seeing piracy as a path to wealth and respect that legitimate options could not provide. Some of these boys would eventually join pirate crews, continuing the cycle that recruited each new generation. The golden age of piracy was brief, lasting only about a decade at its height, but it was long enough to shape expectations and create precedents that influenced Atlantic society for generations. The merchants who traded with pirates, buying their stolen goods and selling them provisions, were essential intermediaries who connected the pirate economy to the legitimate one. These merchants operated in legal grey areas, pretending ignorance about where the goods they purchased had come from while knowing perfectly well that they were receiving stolen property. The profits were substantial. Pirates who needed to convert plunder into supplies quickly were willing to accept prices well below market value, providing margins that honest trade could not match. The merchants who served pirates were businessmen responding to market opportunities, no more and no less, their morality subordinated to their balance sheets. The officials who accepted bribes from pirates were similarly motivated by economic incentives, supplementing inadequate official salaries with payments that corruption made available. A colonial governor who looked the other way while pirates operated in his territory could accumulate substantial wealth, far more than his official position provided. The temptation was constant, and many officials succumbed, creating the tolerance for piracy that allowed the Golden Age to flourish. The suppression of piracy required not only naval force, but also administrative reform, replacing corrupt officials with honest ones who would enforce laws that their predecessors had ignored. The lawyers who defended captured pirates at trial performed a necessary function in the legal system, ensuring that defendants received the representation that the law guaranteed. Some of these lawyers were sincere advocates who believed that even pirates deserved fair trials. Others were hired professionals who did their jobs without moral investment in the outcome. The defences they mounted were usually unsuccessful, since the evidence against most defendants was overwhelming, but occasionally they secured acquittals or reduced sentences for clients who could credibly claim coercion. The trials at Cape Coast included defence counsel, giving the proceedings a legitimacy that simple execution without process would have lacked. The judges who presided over pirate trials were responsible for applying law that was clear in principle but complicated in practice. Piracy was a capital offence, but distinguishing willing pirates from forced men required evaluation of evidence and credibility. The judges at Cape Coast examined each defendant individually, rendering verdicts that ranged from execution to acquittal based on their assessment of culpability. The process was not perfectly fair by modern standards, but it was fairer than the summary executions that pirates might have received in other circumstances. The trials established precedents for handling mass captures that would influence legal practice for years afterward. The executioners who carried out the sentences were craftsmen of death, skilled at inflicting the punishment that the law prescribed. Hanging was the standard method, conducted publicly to maximize the deterrent effect. The condemned men were taken to the scaffold, their offences proclaimed, their final words solicited, and then dropped through the trap to strangle at the end of the rope. Death was not always quick. Some men struggled for minutes before dying, their agony visible to the crowds that gathered to watch. The bodies were often gibbeted afterward, hung in chains where ships would pass and sailors would see the consequences of piracy, displayed in rotting flesh and bleaching bones. The memory of the Cape Coast executions persisted in Atlantic maritime culture for generations, a cautionary tale told to young sailors contemplating the pirate life. The scale of the executions, 52 men hanged from a single crew, made an impression that individual executions could not. The message was clear. Piracy led to death, and not the quick death of battle, but the slow death of imprisonment, trial, and public execution, with one's body afterward displayed as a warning to others. The Golden Age ended partly because this message was received and believed, deterring men who might otherwise have chosen piracy, and encouraging those already committed to seek pardons while they still could. The end of the Golden Age did not mean the end of piracy, which has continued in various forms to the present day, but it meant the end of the particular phenomenon that Roberts had exemplified: large-scale, organised piracy operating openly in major shipping lanes, supported by corrupt officials and tolerated by imperial powers too weak to suppress it. Subsequent piracy was smaller in scale, more secretive in operation, and more quickly suppressed when it attracted official attention. The conditions that had made Roberts's career possible, the combination of weak enforcement, widespread corruption, and abundant targets, did not recur, though individual elements have appeared in various times and places. The treasure that Roberts accumulated, the fortune that nobody found, remains the enduring mystery that draws attention to his story. The quantitative record of his success, 400 ships captured in 3 years, suggests wealth that should have been recoverable somewhere. The qualitative record of his lifestyle, the expensive clothes and the valuable jewels, confirms that he possessed significant resources. Yet almost nothing was found when his ships were captured, and nothing has been found in the 3 centuries since. The mystery is probably unsolvable. The treasure was dispersed through channels that cannot be reconstructed, hidden in places that cannot be found, or destroyed in circumstances that went unrecorded. But the mystery is also irresistible, drawing treasure hunters and historians to the story of Bartholomew Roberts, with the hope that they might be the ones to finally solve it. The sea keeps its secrets, as it has kept the secret of Roberts's final resting place. His body lies somewhere on the Atlantic floor, weighted with the weapons and jewels that his crew threw overboard with him, undiscovered and undiscoverable. The spot is not marked, the location not recorded, the depth unknown. 3 centuries of currents and tides have scattered whatever remains, distributing bones and artifacts across an area too vast to search. Roberts joined the sea in death as he had lived on it in life, becoming part of the ocean that had been his world for the final years of his existence. The stars that guided Roberts across the Atlantic still shine, the same constellations that navigators have used for thousands of years. The North Star still marks north, the Southern Cross still marks south, and the patterns between them still provide the references that sailors need to find their way. Roberts looked at those stars countless times, taking sights and calculating positions, using the ancient knowledge of celestial navigation to move his ships where he wanted them to go. The stars were indifferent to his purposes, providing the same guidance to pirates and navy alike, their light travelling from unimaginable distances to illuminate the small human dramas played out on the ocean surface. The waves that Roberts rode still roll, generated by winds and currents that have not changed in 3 centuries. The Atlantic is the same ocean that it was in 1722, the same water, the same depths, the same essential character. Ships still cross it, though they are powered by engines now rather than sails, and the journeys that took weeks or months now take days. The pirates are gone, replaced by navies and coastguards that enforce order over waters that were once lawless. But the ocean remembers, in some metaphorical sense, the men who sailed it and died on it. The stories written in wakes that dispersed and spray that evaporated, leaving nothing but the memory passed from generation to generation in books and tales. Sleep now as the ocean sleeps, its surface calm beneath the stars, its depths dark and mysterious. The story of Bartholomew Roberts has been told, from beginning to end, from birth in Wales to death off Africa, from obscure sailor to greatest pirate in history. The treasure that he accumulated remains unfound, dispersed or hidden or destroyed, a mystery that will probably never be solved. The legacy that he left persists in the records that document his career, in the articles that defined pirate governance, in the legend that has grown around his name. He was the pirate in crimson silk, the tea-drinking, Bible-reading captain who captured more ships than anyone else ever has. He died at 40, killed by grapeshot in the battle he chose to fight, buried at sea by men who honoured his last wish even in the chaos of defeat. His diamond cross lies with him somewhere on the Atlantic floor, treasure lost to history, waiting for no one because no one will ever find it. The night is complete now, and the tale is told. 400 ships, 3 years, one man who made himself a king of the outlaws and died, as all outlaws must die, violently and young. The treasure that nobody found is part of his legend now, adding mystery to a story already rich with drama. Perhaps someday someone will discover something. A document in an archive, an artifact on a beach, a wreck on the sea floor that will add to what we know. Perhaps the mystery will deepen instead, as more questions arise than answers. Either way, the story of Bartholomew Roberts will continue to be told, passed down through the generations, keeping alive the memory of the greatest pirate who ever lived. Good night, and may your dreams carry you across the seas that Roberts sailed, beneath the stars that guided him, to treasures that wait to be found or wait forever, hidden in the depths where only dreams can reach. Good night. The tools of the pirate trade that Roberts mastered were the same tools that every sailor of his era used, adapted to criminal purposes through ingenuity and violence. The rope that hauled sails on merchant ships became the rope that bound prisoners and hanged the condemned. The cannon that defended lawful vessels became the weapons that attacked them. The flags that identified friendly shipping became the false colours that deceived victims. Roberts used all the technology of his era, turning it against the system that had created it, demonstrating that the same skills that served commerce could also destroy it. His mastery of these tools, his ability to make them serve his purposes as effectively as they served legitimate purposes, was one of the factors that made him so successful. The compass that every ship carried pointed north, regardless of who was sailing, pirate or merchant or naval vessel. The magnetic needle, suspended to swing freely, aligned with the Earth's field to provide direction that was essential for navigation. Roberts's compass was no different from any other, a standard instrument of the sailor's art that he used as sailors had used it for centuries. The compass rose painted on charts, the directions inscribed on instruments, the cardinal points that organized space for navigation, all were shared between pirates and their victims, common knowledge that served opposite purposes in different hands. The technology was neutral, the uses were not. The charts that Roberts consulted showed coastlines, depths, hazards and anchorages, information gathered by explorers and surveyed by cartographers, over generations of Atlantic navigation. These charts were valuable property, updated through experience and copied for distribution to ships that needed them. Pirates captured charts along with other valuables, acquiring navigational information that could be as useful as gold for maintaining operations. Roberts's ability to navigate unfamiliar waters depended partly on charts he had captured, knowledge extracted from victims who had no choice but to provide it. The accumulated wisdom of Atlantic navigation, encoded in charts and sailing directions, became one more resource that pirates exploited. The sextant, or its predecessor the astrolabe, provided the means to measure the angle of celestial bodies above the horizon, calculations that determined latitude and helped estimate longitude. Roberts or his navigators would have used such instruments regularly, taking sights of the sun and stars to fix the ship's position. The mathematics involved was not complex, but it required practice and precision to perform correctly. A skilled navigator could position a ship within a few miles, an unskilled one could be off by hundreds. Roberts's success in moving his ships across the Atlantic and finding targets along distant coasts reflects navigational competence that was not universal among pirates or among sailors generally. The lead line that measured water depth was essential for coastal navigation, where shallow water and hidden reefs could destroy ships that strayed from safe channels. A sailor at the bow would swing the weighted line and cast it forward, calling out depths as the ship moved into unfamiliar waters. The lead weight at the end of the line might have a hollow bottom filled with tallow, which would pick up samples of the seafloor that provided additional information about location. Roberts's operations in coastal waters from Brazil to Newfoundland to Africa required constant use of the lead line, guiding ships through dangers that charts alone could not reveal. The hourglass that measured time aboard ship was turned every half hour, marking the watches that organised shipboard routine. The sand falling through the narrow waist of the glass provided the only reliable timekeeping available at sea. Clocks were too delicate to survive the motion and moisture of shipboard conditions, and accurate chronometers would not be developed for decades. Roberts's operations were timed by these hourglasses, the attacks and escapes and passages measured in half-hour intervals that accumulated into the days and weeks and months of his career. The sand fell steadily, indifferent to events, marking time until time ran out at Cape Lopez. The bell that struck the hours, rung according to the hourglass turns, provided audible time signals that organised work throughout the ship. 8 bells marked the end of each 4-hour watch. The pattern of bells counted out the hours in between. Roberts's crew would have lived by these bells, their activities cued by the sound that penetrated every corner of the ship. The rhythm of work and rest, of watches relieved and duties assigned, was marked by bells that rang regardless of what else was happening. The bells would have rung during the battle that killed Roberts, their sound continuing even as men died and the ship fell into chaos. The hammocks where sailors slept, the lanterns that provided light, the galley where food was prepared, the pumps that kept water out of the hold, all were standard equipment that every ship carried and that pirates used as anyone else did. The material culture of piracy was not distinctive. It was the material culture of seafaring applied to criminal ends. Roberts's ships were equipped like any other ships of their size and type, differing only in the purposes they served and the flags they flew. A naval officer examining a captured pirate ship would find nothing unfamiliar, only familiar equipment put to unfamiliar uses. The night ends as all nights end, with the coming of dawn that Roberts saw so many times from so many decks. The sun rose over the Atlantic as it rises still, painting the sky with colours that have not changed in all the centuries since pirates sailed these waters. The story is complete now, 25,000 words tracing the career of the greatest pirate in history, from his forced recruitment to his violent death, from obscure origins to legendary fame. The treasure that nobody found remains unfound, waiting or not waiting depending on whether there is anything to find. The mystery endures because mysteries are what remain when the answers are lost, when the people who knew are dead and the records they might have left do not exist. Sleep well, and let the morning come when it comes. The pirates are gone, but their stories remain, told in the darkness to help the living sleep. Good night. The final mystery of Bartholomew Roberts is not just where his treasure went, but who he really was. The historical record provides actions and events, captures and escapes, articles and battles, but it does not provide the inner life that would make him fully human. What did he think about during the long watches at sea, when the ship sailed steadily and there was nothing to do but wait? What did he feel when he ordered men killed, when he watched prisoners tortured for information, when he counted the gold that his violence had produced? Was he troubled by conscience or serenely indifferent to the suffering he caused? Did he believe his own justifications, or did he know himself for what he was? These questions have no answers. The man in crimson silk remains opaque behind his costume and his reputation. The contradictions in his character are part of what makes him fascinating. The piety and the piracy, the democracy and the violence, the discipline and the indulgence, the elegance and the brutality, all coexisted in one man whose psychology we cannot reconstruct. Perhaps he compartmentalized, keeping his faith in one box and his crimes in another, never allowing them to interact. Perhaps he rationalized, constructing justifications that satisfied whatever conscience he possessed. Perhaps he simply did not think about it, acting as circumstances required without philosophical reflection. The historical record does not tell us, and we cannot know what it does not reveal. The crew who followed him remain equally mysterious, their individual identities submerged in the collective record of captures and trials. The 264 men taken at Cape Lopez were individuals with histories, families, hopes, and fears that the documents do not preserve. Their names appear in trial records, their fates in execution rolls, but their lives are lost. Some were volunteers who chose piracy. Others were forced men who had no choice. Some were hardened criminals who had committed crimes before joining Roberts. Others were ordinary sailors who had drifted into outlawry through circumstance. The mass of the crew blurs into anonymity, individual faces invisible in the crowd that followed Roberts to victory and death. The ships that Roberts captured are similarly anonymous, most of them unnamed in the records that survive. 400 ships is a number, not a list. We know the total, but not the particulars. Each of those ships had a name, a crew, a cargo, an owner, a destination that was interrupted by pirate attack. Each capture was an event with its own details: the pursuit, the approach, the flag raised, the surrender or resistance, the looting, the disposition of ship and crew. These events blur together in the aggregate, reduced to statistics that cannot convey the human experience of being captured by pirates. The victims of Roberts's career are as anonymous as his followers, their individual experiences lost in the mass of 400 captures. The treasure that nobody found is the final blank in the record, the gap where there should be accounting but there is only mystery. Treasure is concrete, measurable, recoverable in principle even if lost in practice. The absence of Roberts's treasure is conspicuous, a missing piece in a puzzle that should be complete. The explanations offered, spending, dispersal, concealment, destruction, fill the gap with hypotheses but not with facts. We do not know what happened to the fortune that 400 ships should have produced, and we probably never will. The mystery is part of the story now, inseparable from the narrative of Roberts's career, adding romance to history and imagination to fact. The sea that took Roberts's body keeps him still, somewhere in the waters off Cape Lopez, where the Swallow's broadside cut him down. The Diamond Crossed rests with him, and whatever else his crew threw overboard in those frantic moments when they honoured his wish to be buried at sea. The Atlantic does not give up its dead. The bodies that sink into its depths become part of its ecosystem, consumed and dispersed until nothing recognisable remains. Roberts is part of the ocean now, his atoms mingled with the water and the creatures that live in it, his physical existence transformed into something diffuse and eternal. The legend that survives him is more durable than flesh, preserved in documents and stories that have outlasted the man by 3 centuries. The legend says that he was the greatest pirate who ever lived, and by the measure of ships captured, the legend is true. The legend says that he dressed in crimson silk and drank only tea, and that too is documented. The legend says that he captured 400 ships and accumulated treasure beyond counting, and the first part is certain, even if the second remains a mystery. The legend is not the man, but it is what we have, the residue of a life that ended violently and left no heir to carry its memory. Rest now as Roberts rests, at peace after the violence of his life, silent after the thunder of his guns. The story is told, the treasure unfound, the mystery preserved for future generations who will wonder, as we wonder where the gold went and who the man really was. The golden age of piracy is long past, its pirates dead, its ships rotted, its treasures spent or lost. But the stories remain, told and retold, embellished and corrected, keeping alive the memory of men who rejected the rules of their world and made rules of their own. Bartholomew Roberts was the greatest of them all, and his story deserves to be remembered even if his treasure is never found. Good night, and may your dreams be rich with adventure and mystery. Good night.